Thank you, Steve, to the man who wears man's clothes. Steve Schrader, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Frank Turek. Before I get started, let me ask you this. How many have heard me before, or this is your first time? How many of you are here this evening? How many don't respond to surveys? That's what I really want to know. It's an election year. 3 out of 10 don't respond to surveys. The first question I always start with is, why are you here? I don't mean why are you here in this session, but why are you here on earth? What is the purpose of your life? I mean, is life just a glorified Monopoly game? Get a whole bunch of stuff now because when the game is over, it's all going to go back in the box? Is that what life's about? One preacher put it this way. He said, one day you are going to die. And they're going to dig a hole somewhere, and they're going to put you in a box, and then they're going to lower you into that hole. Then they're going to throw dirt in your face and come back to the church and eat potato salad. Is that it? You take a dirt nap for eternity and that's the meaning to life? I don't think that's the meaning to life. I think everyone in here has a divine purpose for being, and everybody outside this room has a divine purpose for being. And you can find that divine purpose in this ancient collection of books we call the Bible. Now, when you say that you think the Bible's true, particularly when you go to a college campus, which I go to frequently, they look at you like you have three heads. What are you, nuts? This book true? It has miracles in it. We don't believe in miracles. It doesn't have contradictions in it. You can't believe this book. I want to give you evidence that indeed this book is true. And in order to do that, we're going to try and cover 4 basic questions based on our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The first question is, does truth exist? This book, the Bible, can't be true if truth doesn't exist, or if it's just true for you but not for me, or all truth is relative. You can't say that book is really true if those claims are so. Of course, if there is no truth, then this book can't be true either. The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking, who recently said you don't need God to start the universe. Well, if there is no truth, Hawking isn't right either. You can see there's a problem now with this claim. We're going to answer yes, you can know truth, there is truth and you can know it. And then we're going to move on to question 2. Does God exist? The Bible can't be the Word of God if there is no God. If there's no God, throw the Bible away and every other book that talks about God. Today I'm going to review evidence very briefly that there really is a God, that there really is a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator. I'm going to mention 2 scientific arguments and 1 philosophical argument that will show you that the being with those characteristics really exists. I'm not going to use the Bible for those arguments. Those arguments are taught in the Bible, but you don't need the Bible to know them. Third question is, are miracles possible? The Bible can't be true if miracles are not possible. If the great skeptic David Hume was right, who said you shouldn't believe in miracles, then you ought not believe the Bible. Today I hope to show you that not only are miracles possible, but the greatest miracle of all has already occurred, and we have scientific evidence for it. We'll review that today. Then we're going to get to the big question, hopefully later this afternoon, and that is the New Testament true? The New Testament doesn't have a prayer. If truth doesn't exist, God doesn't exist, or miracles are not possible. But if truth exists, God exists, and miracles are possible, then we can see if we have an accurate, historically reliable account of miracles occurring in the 1st century to a man named Jesus and his apostles in the 27 handwritten Greek manuscripts we now collect and call the New Testament. If these documents are accurate and tell us that miracles really did occur in the 1st century, then I think you can say the entire Old Testament is true as well. Why? Who's in the New Testament that can authenticate the Old Testament? Jesus, right? If Jesus really is God, as the New Testament claims he is, now that's a big if, but if he really is, then whatever God teaches is true. Jesus taught the entire Old Testament is the Word of God. So if the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in. Now, as Steve mentioned, we do have a TV program on this. I'll show you the intro to it. You'll see these 4 questions come up. Here's the intro. Groovin' music, huh? Now that TV program is on every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. Eastern Time on DirecTV Channel 378. How many people have DirecTV? DirecTV, can I see your hands? Okay, maybe about 20% of us. Why not the rest of us? Friends don't let friends watch cable. Come on, if you want to get out and have enough faith to be an atheist, you got to get DirecTV. You can also go to our website at that time and see it because it's broadcast over the internet. Does anyone here have Sky Angel? Sky Angel? You got Sky Angel? It's supposed to be on channel 114 Wednesday nights at 10. Channel 114 Wednesday nights at 10. As Steve mentioned, we also have a radio program every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. I don't know what stations. There's 144 stations, but you can get the station listing at that website, or you can listen to it online live or in podcast. What we do is we present evidence for Christianity and we cross-examine ideas against it. We take phone calls, that kind of thing. This morning we had Pastor Wally on and Craig Hazen. We were talking about the great discipleship program that we have here at Mount Airy Bible Church that he's been running, which is unique. And I think every church ought to have this kind of discipleship program. So we were talking about that on the air today. Now, for me to cover all these points, truth, God, miracles, New Testament, and then if I time this just right, we'll have absolutely no time for your questions, by the way. Now, we'll get to your questions. To summarize this 450-page book in the amount of time we have, it's virtually impossible. But I can probably do it because I'm originally from New Jersey, okay? You see, I speak at 150 words a minute with gusts to 350, okay? So if you can't keep up, the book is available on the book table over there, as well as a complete DVD set that goes through this material in a lot more detail. This DVD set has 10 one-hour TV programs on it that go through the material, and it goes into a lot more detail than what I can go into here. So if you want more, you can get that. And by the way, all the proceeds from the sale of the books and the DVDs will go to feed needy children. Mine. Okay? Just so you know, I've got 3 sons. Did somebody already use that line? Somebody stole my line. Schrader. Who was it? Kokel. Kokel stole my line? I'm telling you. All right, I'm going to start using his lines now. That's it. Everybody laughs at that line. Gee. Kokel, he's not even a Christian. All these tactics he's using. Anyway, I've got 3 sons. 2 of them are in college, so I need some help here. The oldest one just graduated University of South Carolina, and now he is an Air Force officer down in San Angelo, Texas as an intelligence officer. Just started school down there. The second one is an Air Force ROTC too. He's a junior. And the third one we just sent off to South Carolina as well. They all Gamecocks. They all went down there. They all want to beat Alabama today. Yeah, probably not. But if it does, we'll be talking to you later. Let me get your email. So my wife now, by the way, are empty nesters. Took us a while to get used to that. About 10 minutes. Right? That's how long it took to change the locks. Any empty nesters in here? All right. You notice one of the great things about being an empty nester? The house stays clean. Did you notice that? And our house is clean right now. It's just amazing. Anyway, there's the website, crossexamine.org. What I'm going to try and do today is I'm going to spend just a short period of time on truth and God, because yesterday here a small group of us went through points 1 and 2, and I want to try and get to points 3 and 4 and spend more time there. So what I'm about to show you here in points 1 and 2 is a very short abbreviation of what I normally cover on a college campus. So I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights. If you want more, you can get the book. All right, let's start at point 1, does truth exist? And whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson, right? Because Tom Cruise had him on the witness stand, and Cruise said to him, "I want the truth, Colonel." And what did Nicholson say? You can't handle the truth. Well, there's a lot of people who can't handle the truth. They're saying there is no truth. They're saying it's just your truth. They're saying all truth is relative. Well, if we can't answer those claims, we can't say that there is truth. We'll get to that in a minute, but let's give an easy definition of truth. Truth is telling it like it is. If I say here we are at Mount Airy Bible Church, that would be telling it like it is. If I say here we are at Texas A&M, where I'll be on Monday, that wouldn't be telling it like it is. Truth is telling it like it is. And I'm here to say, by the way, that all truth is absolute truth. Something that is true for all persons at all times in all places. There are no relative truths. Now, when you say things like this, people will say counterclaims to you. They'll say, no, 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 wait, all truth isn't absolute. They'll say things like, there is no truth. Well, if someone ever says to you there is no truth, what should you say to them? Yeah, simply say, hey, is that true? Now, we call this in the book the Roadrunner tactic, where we turn a claim on itself to show that it's self-defeating. I don't have time to go into that here. It's all in the book. But the beauty of it is this one little claim makes you look like a super genius. Okay? How about this one? You hear this all the time. It's true for you, but not for me. What do you say to that? Christianity's true for you, but Buddhism's true for me. I got this at Michigan State the other night. Somebody got up and said, it's true for you, but not for me. What do you say to somebody who says that? Simply say, true for you, but not for me. Hey, is that true for everybody? Is true for you, but not for me, true for everybody? Because if true for you, but not for me is true for everybody, then true for you, but not for me can't be true because it's true for everybody. I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough, but that's because it's logically self-defeating. It violates what we call the law of non-contradiction, a first fundamental rule of all thought. Actually, there's a more fun way of dealing with that. If somebody says true for you, but not for me, say, sure, go try that with your bank teller. Go to your bank teller one day and say, look, the economy's down, I need some money. Give me $100,000 out of my account. Bank teller looks at your account and says, I'm sorry, you only have $16.04 in your account. It's very easy for you to get the money. You simply look back at the teller and go, ha, that's true for you, but not for me. Give me the 100 grand. Are you going to get the money? No, if it's true you only had $16.04 in your account, that's true for all people at all times in all places when referring to you. That's just true. Or you're going a little fast down Highway 70 out here. I've driven this highway a couple of days now, and there are police officers out there, if you haven't noticed. Well, suppose one of them pulls you over. You're going 90 in a 55. He pulls you over. He walks up to your car, knocks on your window. You put the window down. He looks down at you, and he goes, you were going 90 in a 55. It's very easy to get out of a ticket. You simply look back up at him, and you go, ha, that's true for you, but not for me. And you speed away. Can't give you a ticket if it's not true. No, if it's true you were going 90 at that time, that's true for all people at all times in all places when referring to you. How about this claim? You hear this all the time. There's no truth in anything but science. In fact, this is basically what Stephen Hawking is saying in his book, The Grand Design. It's what Richard Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion. What's the problem with the claim? It's not a scientific truth. Simply ask, is that a scientific truth? Can you go in the laboratory and prove that? No, that's a philosophical claim. I don't have time to get into this right now, but I'll just briefly mention it, that the debate between the intelligent design people and the Darwinists is not a debate over evidence. Everybody's looking at the same evidence. You know what's a debate over? It's a debate over philosophy. It's a debate over what causes will be considered philosophically available to us prior to doing the experiment or prior to investigating. And then it's also a philosophical exercise. Once you get the data, how do you interpret it? It's a philosophical exercise, and you can't do science without philosophy. We just did a couple of TV programs on this, and there's an article on our website. It was also at townhall.com called Science Doesn't Say Anything, Scientists Do. All data needs to be interpreted, and that requires philosophy. Unfortunately, as Einstein himself said, the man of science is a poor philosopher. Stephen Hawking is a poor philosopher. This book is defeated on philosophical grounds, if you look at it. You know what he says in the book? He says that free will is an illusion. Well, if free will is an illusion, so is this book, because he didn't freely write it. He says several other self-defeating things in the book. So don't be put off when somebody says they're a scientist and they know the truth. If they conduct philosophical errors or commit philosophical errors, then their scientific conclusions are going to be in error. This is the big one you'll get quite a bit. You ought not judge, you ignorant, arrogant Christians. Jesus said, don't judge. Why are you judging? First of all, what's the logical problem with this? It's a judgment. So the next time somebody says you ought not judge, put your hands on your hips and say, then why are you judging me for judging? See, because that's what they're doing. They're judging you. By the way, did Jesus say don't judge? No, what did Jesus say? He said, judge not lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you'll be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, take the log out of your own eye first. Then you'll be better able to help your brother. Is Jesus telling us not to judge there? No, he's telling us to judge. He's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying get the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. So that is not a command not to judge. It is a command on how to judge. In other words, if you've got that problem in your life, get it out of your life first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. It would be suicide not to make judgments. You've made 100 judgments today between right and wrong, safe choices from dangerous choices. Everybody makes judgments. Atheists make judgments. Richard Dawkins makes judgments. He makes judgments there is no God. We got here by some cosmic accident. There is no objective morality, except the objective morality that says you ought not impose your morality on him. He thinks that's objective, right? Everybody makes judgments. The only question is, are your judgments true? Jesus says in John 7:24, stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. However, Jesus did save a very stern rebuke for the people who were judgmental. Judgmental. Who were the judgmental ones in his society? The Pharisees. And who were the Pharisees? They were the religious and political leaders. Jesus got involved in politics? Yes! Jesus went after the political leaders. And when he did so, he went with great gusto. If you don't think so, read Matthew 23. What does he say in Matthew 23? He's going after the Pharisees. And he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You look great on the outside, whitewashed tombs, but on the inside, you're full of dead men's bones. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. You go a mile to make a convert, and then once you make them a convert, you make them twice as much a son of hell as you are. How will you avoid being condemned to hell? Sweet and gentle Jesus said this. Yes, Jesus was not Barney. Can't we all just get along, boys and girls? No. He was not Mr. Rogers. Jesus was a drill sergeant when he needed to be. He got in people's faces sometimes. Yes, other times he was quiet and sensitive, but sometimes he got in people's faces. Why? Because sometimes you have to. In fact, some people need a slap upside their head, don't they? And when you don't give it to them, basically what you're doing is you're enabling them. Sometimes you got to be tough. Don't fall into this cultural idea that Jesus was some kind of sissy. Sometimes he was very direct. Other times he was much more sensitive. What's the definition of maturity? The appropriate behavior at the appropriate time. Jesus exhibited the appropriate behavior at the appropriate time. He knew when to be sensitive and he knew when to be tough. And we have to do that as well. And yes, Jesus was involved in politics. By the way, I was at college in Michigan the other night, and a kid was sitting in the front row with a sweatshirt on and had a cross on it. And the front of the sweatshirt said, "This message banned in 51 countries." Now, what's the implication of that? I could give you 100 reasons why Christians ought to be involved in politics, just like they ought to be involved in business, education, law, everything else too. But let me just give you one. If you don't think Christians ought to be involved in politics, if you just think we ought to be involved in evangelism, discipleship, and worship, or if you think evangelism, discipleship, and worship are important, like I do, then you have to be involved in politics. You say, why? Because you can't do what we're doing in this room right now in those 51 countries. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. If you don't think politics is important to Christianity, you got to go to Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China, where I've been. You can't do what we're doing here right now legally in those countries. Because politically they've ruled it out. And guess what? If Christians don't stand up, pretty soon they're going to shut these doors. If for no other reason we ought to be involved. We ought to be involved just for the ability to spread the gospel. There's many other reasons too. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I just want to point that out because a lot of Christians think, oh no, We can't get involved. We might offend somebody. What do you mean, like Jesus in Matthew 23? No, we wouldn't want to do that. How many times have you heard people say, oh, that person is such a saint? That person has never said a bad word about anyone. Well, if that's the definition of a saint, Jesus was no saint. Because Jesus told people like it was, and sometimes he got in their faces. Now, there's more on this, but this ability to turn a claim on itself will make you a fearless apologist, this roadrunner tactic, and it's an easy way for you to be a lie detector, which reminds me of Homer Simpson. Check this out. I'll need sound for this.
Now we're going to run a few tests. This is a simple lie detector. I'll ask you a few yes or no questions, and you just answer truthfully. Do you understand?
Yes.
Can everybody see that as a self-defeating statement, ladies and gentlemen? Okay. Of course there's truth. To say there's no truth is to utter a truth claim. It's self-defeating. There is truth out there. There's a lot more in the book and a lot more in the normal presentation, but I want to move on to does God exist because we have limited time. All right? Is it true that God exists? And when we talk about this, we've got to define our terms. What do we mean by God? I'm talking here about a theistic God, and I'm about to give you 3 arguments for a theistic God. But before I do, let me define what I mean by a theistic God. A theistic God is a God who's beyond the world, who created the world and sustains the world. A theistic God is roughly like a painter is to a painting. Michelangelo paints the painting. His attributes are expressed in the painting, but Michelangelo is not the painting. The worldview that believes God is the painting or God is the universe is called pantheism. I'm God, you're God, we're all God. You know pantheism. Use the Force, Luke. The whole Star Wars series is pantheism. That's not the kind of God we're talking about here. We're talking about a theistic God, a God who's beyond the world, who created the world and sustains the world. What's the evidence for this theistic God? There's a lot of evidence. 3 of them we cover in the book in some detail, and I'm just going to mention them here. The first is the argument from the beginning of the universe known as the cosmological argument. Cosmological comes from the Greek word which means world or universe. It says if the universe had a beginning, it must have had a beginner. The second argument is the argument from design known as the teleological argument. Telos, meaning design or purpose. It says if there's design in the universe or design in life, there must be a designer. Now remember earlier I said I want to give you 2 scientific arguments and 1 philosophical argument. These are the 2 scientific arguments. You can get evidence for these arguments by either looking through a telescope or looking into a microscope. The third argument I'm going to give you, though, is not scientific. It's more philosophical in nature, yet it's the argument all of us have known since we were very small children, and it's the argument from morality called the moral argument. It says if there is a moral law prescription out there, then there must be a moral law prescriber. In other words, if there is a prescription that says certain things are right and certain things are wrong morally, then somebody had to prescribe that. And we'll get to that in just a minute. We're going to cover very briefly the first 2 arguments, the cosmological argument and then the teleological argument. Now, many say this points to the big... Now, many Christians go, Frank, we're Christians. We don't believe in the Big Bang. You guys don't believe in the Big Bang? I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it, okay? The evidence for a beginning to the universe is quite good. In fact, this is the evidence that we go through in the book, the scientific evidence. It's in an acronym, SURGE, S-U-R-G-E. This is all in Chapter 3 of the book, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But this evidence shows beyond any reasonable doubt that space, matter, and time had a beginning. The S stands for the second law of thermodynamics, which says the universe is running down, it's running out of energy. Well, if it's running out of energy and it didn't have a beginning, we would have run out of energy a long time ago. But we still have energy right now, which implies the universe had a beginning. The U in SURGE stands for the fact that the universe is expanding. This was discovered by Edwin Hubble. That when he looked out his telescope, he noticed all the galaxies were moving away. Well, Hubble deduced if we could watch history in reverse, we would see all those galaxies collapse back ultimately to nothing. That has implications, of course. If the universe exploded into being out of nothing, what caused it? If space, matter, and time had a beginning, the cause must be outside of space, matter, and time, right? It must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Now, what do you think about when you think of a spaceless, timeless, immaterial cause? God. The R stands for the radiation afterglow. That's the remnant heat from the initial Big Bang explosion. It was discovered by two scientists working at Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey. Back in 1965, they discovered the remnant heat from the initial Big Bang explosion. They won Nobel Prizes for this in 1978. The G stands for the great galaxy seeds. This is explained in some detail in the book. Basically, these are temperature variations in that radiation afterglow that allowed the galaxies to form in the early universe. And those temperature variations that were found were down to 1 part in 100,000. The leader of the expedition, a man by the name of George Smoot, who now teaches at UCal said that we found the machining marks of the Creator. These temperature variations were just so that allowed the universe to form into its present state. He said if those were off by a little bit, we wouldn't be here. In fact, by the way, that particular discovery right there, which they won Nobel Prizes for in 2006, dispenses the notion that you don't need God to start the universe. Because you hear all the time Darwinists say, well, if Darwinism's true, you don't need God. That's nonsense. Even if Darwinism were 100% true, and I don't think it is, we point out why in the book, but even if it were 100% true, you still need a designer at the beginning of the universe. The creation event was not a random explosion. It was not as if we blew up pre-existing material and it went randomly everywhere. The creation event was a highly fine-tuned, shepherded event. Somebody was shepherding the creation event through and is still doing so to this day, as we'll see here in a minute. So you need a designer for the universe, much less life. The E, of course, stands for Einstein's theory of general relativity, and Einstein knew back in 1917 that space, matter, and time were correlative, that they came into existence together, that you can't have space without matter, and you can't have matter without space-time. They all came into existence together. And he knew this. He didn't like it initially, but he ultimately accepted it, that the universe and time itself had a beginning, which led agnostic astronomer Robert Jastrow to say this: the astronomical evidence leads to a biblical view of the origin of the world. The essential element in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis is the same. He's an agnostic. In fact, he sat in the same chair Edwin Hubble sat in until he died about 3 years ago. Edwin Hubble sat at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Pasadena, California, where he discovered the expanding universe. And Jastrow was the last guy to sit in there recently, until, as I say, he died a few years ago. And he was an agnostic, yet he said, this lines up with Genesis. Other Nobel Prize winners in science stated the same thing. In physics, these are all gentlemen who helped discover the R and the G in the SURGE acronym I just gave you. The first is Arno Penzias. Here's what he said: the best data we have concerning the Big Bang are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. His colleague, Robert Wilson, put it this way: certainly there was something that set it all off. I can't think of a better theory of the origin of the universe to match Genesis. George Smoot, the man who teaches at UCal Berkeley, who said we found the machining marks of the Creator, said this: there is no doubt that a parallel exists between the Big Bang as an event and the Christian notion of creation from nothing. So the Big Bang cosmology points to an ultimate beginning of space, matter, and time, very consistent with in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Which means, again, if space, matter, and time had a beginning, the cause must be outside of space, matter, and time. A spaceless, timeless, immaterial cause. Now, there's more in the book, obviously, but in the interest of time, we got to move to the teleological argument. And this is the argument from design, and it shows that the universe is precisely designed. And this is sometimes called the anthropic principle. Anthropic comes from the Greek word anthropos, which means the universe appears to be highly fine-tuned for mankind to exist. Here are just a few of the attributes of the universe that show it's highly fine-tuned. Stephen Hawking said, if we were to change the expansion rate of the universe by 1 part in 1,000 million a second after the Big Bang, we wouldn't be here. So the initial creation event was highly fine-tuned, and it's still fine-tuned to this day. Also, our solar system is tuned just right. Where are we in the solar system? There we are, right there, third rock from the sun, okay? If we were just a little bit closer to or a little bit further away from the sun, we wouldn't be here. A little bit closer to, we'd burn up. A little bit further away, we'd freeze. We are what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. It is not too hot. It is not too cold. It is just right. The axial tilt, 23.5 degrees. You change that slightly, we don't exist. Earth rotation, 24 hours. Change that slightly, we don't exist. The size and distance of the moon from us, if you change that slightly, we don't exist. If Jupiter was not in its current orbit, we wouldn't be here. Why not? Because Jupiter acts as a cosmic vacuum cleaner. Its gravitational force is so strong, it attracts most of the meteors to it rather than us. In fact, if you take a close-up look at Jupiter, you know what these purple marks are? They're comet fragment strikes that are bigger than the Earth. Thank God for Jupiter. If Jupiter wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. The same thing is true with Saturn. Now, there's a lot more, again, on this, but the bottom line is that the universe is highly fine-tuned. Somebody has tuned it. As if there's a control room somewhere that has all these dials set to precisely the right level. And if you go into that control room and move one dial slightly, the universe is out of existence. Not only is the universe highly fine-tuned, so is life. You see this? This is the first one-celled amoeba or something like it that the Darwinists say we all evolved from. You heard of the theory of macroevolution, from the goo to you via the zoo? Okay, this is the goo. Or from the infantile to the reptile to the crocodile to the gentile. This is the infantile. Now, in Darwin's day, this was not considered to be any big deal. That maybe non-living chemicals could come together without intelligent intervention, and this life could form, and then from that point, natural selection could take over, and voila, here we all are. Today, we know that a cell is not a little blob of protoplasm. We've opened Darwin's black box, the cell, and we realize the cell is far more complicated than even this laptop computer I'm showing you this presentation on. It is a miniature factory with scores of computer-like devices in it. We've never created such a thing. And to show you how much information is in a cell, I got to take you to your breakfast table. How many people in here like alphabet cereal? Let's suppose you want a bowl of alphabet cereal, you're a teenager, you come downstairs to have a bowl of alphabet cereal, and once you get downstairs, you see that this cereal is knocked over on the table, and right in the middle of the table, the letters spell, "Take out the garbage, Mom." What are you going to assume? The cat knocked the box over? Earthquake shook the house? No, you're going to say that's intelligent design from an intelligent being, Mom. Or let's suppose you're walking along the beach and you see in the sand, "John loves Mary." Are you going to say the waves did that? The crabs came out of the water and made that message? No, you're going to say there has to have been an intelligent being there. Why? Because you know that messages only come from minds. They don't come from natural forces. By the way, this is the whole premise of the movie Contact. You ever see the movie Contact? With Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey. What are they looking for? They're looking for E.T. And Jodie Foster gets a message from outer space. What does she get? Prime numbers, 2 to 111. She gets real excited. She runs inside and goes, "Wow, E.T. is out there." Why? Prime numbers from 2 to 111? How did she know E.T. is out there? Because natural laws don't create messages like that. Only minds do. Well, if only minds create messages like that, what do you say to this message? The message that is in every one of us called DNA. It's a message like "Take out the garbage, Mom." It's just a lot more complicated. Every living thing has DNA. You have DNA. I have DNA. A banana has DNA. Where does this code come from? And by the way, how much of this code is in a one-celled amoeba? And before I tell you, how big is an amoeba? Well, you can line up several hundred amoebas in an inch. And in each amoeba, there's at least 1,000 volumes of an encyclopedia of information, DNA information in it. Now, to believe that that resulted by natural forces without intelligence is like believing that the Library of Congress resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. I don't have enough faith to believe that. You have to have more faith to be an atheist than just to believe there's intelligence out there. It seems to me the first life requires an intelligent cause. Now, by the way, some of you may go, well, who told you this? Did some Christian tell you this? No, you know who told me this? That there's this much information in an amoeba? Richard Dawkins, the most famous atheist in the world today. He even admits there's this much information. Well, how did it get in there? Natural laws don't create this stuff. Intelligence does. By the way, this is not a God of the gaps argument. You know, you don't have a natural explanation, so you plug God in. Why is this not a God of the gaps argument? Because it's not just that you lack a natural explanation when you see take out the garbage mom on your kitchen table. It's that is positive, empirically verifiable evidence for an intelligent being. When you see take out the garbage mom, you go, that's just like mom. Natural forces couldn't have done that. Only mom could do that. That's positive evidence for an intelligent being. All right, again, there's more in the book. We got to move on to the moral argument because I want to get to points 3 and 4, miracles in the New Testament. I'll talk about miracles. I think Wally's going to do some miracles for us. I'll just talk about them. Didn't you tell me that earlier, Wally? You're going to do some miracles? Okay, good, good. Let's talk about the moral argument. There is nothing wrong with murder. There is nothing wrong with rape. There's nothing wrong with slavery. There's nothing wrong with child abuse. There's nothing wrong with racism. There's nothing wrong with theft unless God exists. In fact, if there is no God, brace yourself, you can't say that this was really wrong. The Holocaust. One young lady at a college said, that's offensive. I said, I agree with you, but it's true. This really happened. If there is no God, you can't say this is really objectively wrong. Why not? Because that's just your opinion against Hitler's opinion. If there's no standard beyond humanity, if it's just human beings, then you can't say that this is really wrong. It's just your opinion against Hitler's opinion. But we all intuitively understand this is really wrong. So there must be a moral law beyond us that prescribes this. In fact, how do you know who's right and who's wrong? Mother Teresa or Hitler? Well, in order to see this, let's use another example. How do you know which map of Scotland is better? Is it map A or map B? What would you need to see in order to know which map is better? Scotland, right? You need to see a real unchanging place called Scotland. And when you did, you could see that map A, while it's not perfect, is a better representation of the real Scotland than is map B. If Scotland doesn't exist, then those two maps are meaningless, right? But since Scotland does exist, then we can see that map A measures up to the real Scotland better than does map B. Get off there, bug. You guys have stink bugs everywhere, don't you? That bug right there is more complicated, has more DNA in it, and is more of a nuisance. But what you do, oh, there he goes. See? There he is right there. Watch out. Bombs away. What we do is we measure these maps by the real thing. That's exactly what we do when we compare Mother Teresa and Hitler. Mother Teresa wasn't the standard. Hitler wasn't the standard. There's a standard beyond both of them by which we measure both of them. And we say Mother Teresa measured up to the standard better than did Hitler. What's the standard? God's very nature. He's the standard of good. He's where the buck stops. His nature is the standard. And on a college campus, I normally say, look, if there is no objective morality, then the Nazis were not wrong. Last year, I was at Michigan State, and there were a couple of atheists sitting right over here. And during the Q&A period, we got talking about morality. And I said to him, well, you're an atheist. What is your standard for morality? And he said, one of the two said, the standard is whatever society decides is moral. So I said, are you telling me that if you lived in a Nazi society and they decided that killing Jews was wrong, that killing Jews would be okay? And he stopped and he got real red and his face contorted a little bit, his upper lip quivered, and he said, yes. And his friend right next to him said, no. But he was just trying to be consistent with his worldview. He knew in his heart that the answer was no. That's why he was quivering. But he had to suppress that truth to say yes. As Paul says in Romans 1, we suppress the truth in unrighteousness because we want to go our own way. He was suppressing what he knew was true. But you can't say the Nazis were really wrong unless there's a standard beyond humanity, beyond Hitler and beyond us. You can't say that love is any better than rape. It means that freedom is no better than slavery. It means that tolerance is no better than intolerance. If there's any sort of absolute for a liberal, it's tolerance, right? You've got to be tolerant. Well, if there's no God, you don't have to be tolerant because there's no standard beyond us. By the way, Christians are not called to be tolerant. Did you know that? Tolerance is too weak. Christians are called to love. See, tolerance says hold your nose and put up with them. Love says reach out and help them. And sometimes you have to, in order to help somebody, you have to tell them they're wrong. Notice that? It's unloving to tell people that the behavior they're engaging in, which is destructive to them and others, is okay. That's unloving. Also, if there is no objective morality, religious crusades are not wrong. How many times do you hear atheists say, well, you evil Christians, you contributed to the crusades? Whoa, 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 hold on. What's wrong with crusades? If there's no God, what's wrong with anything? Why are you complaining about the crusades? By the way, can anyone in here tell me when the first crusade was ordered? No. About 1100. 1095 was the first crusade. What were the crusades, by the way? They were a 400-year delayed response to Muslim aggression, which started in about 637 or 638 AD. Christians finally said, we got to take the Holy Land back after 400 years. Now, there were a lot of atrocities committed on the Crusades, don't get me wrong, but for people who think that Christianity spread by the sword, I say take a history course. Okay, Christianity was established for over 1,000 years before the first crusade ever was ordered, and it was a military response to Muslim aggression. But there's nothing wrong with crusades or anything else if there is no God. In fact, if there is no objective morality, you can't complain about the problem of evil. Why can't you complain about the problem of evil? Because there is no such thing as evil if there's no such thing as objective good. See, evil doesn't disprove God. Evil may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God. Why not? Because without good, you wouldn't even know what evil was. And without good, you're not going to know evil, but you can't know good unless there's a God who is the standard of good. So evil actually points back to God. The shadows prove the sunshine. You can have sunshine without shadows, but you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. So the whole argument against God collapses ultimately, because God is the ultimate standard of good. That's why when Christopher Hitchens, who, as Steve said, I debated a couple times, this is actually a picture from our second debate, when he writes the book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, first of all, what does the word poison mean? It's a way of saying that religion is evil. He has no standard of evil. He is an atheist because he has no standard of good. I kept asking him, what's your standard of good? How do you get a moral law from materials? You're a materialist. You think that the only things that exist are materials. The periodic table. Where do you get morality from that? When you do something wrong, who are you offending? The carbon atom? The benzene molecule? So you can't poison anything. And in fact, religion doesn't poison everything. Everything poisons religion. See, I poison religion because I don't live up to the pure words of Christ. In fact, I can't live up to them. I'm imperfect. In the second debate with him, I admitted, I said, look, I'm a hypocrite. I am a hypocrite. In fact, everyone's a hypocrite. That's why we need a savior, because we are hypocrites. If we were perfect, we wouldn't need church. We wouldn't need Christ. We wouldn't need any of this. I always tell people who say, hey, you know, I can't go to church because all those hypocrites down there. I always say, come on down, pal. We got room for one more. That's what the church is. It's a hospital for sinners. It's not a country club for saints. We're all sinners. That's why we need a savior. In fact, if you're not a hypocrite, your standards are too low. You gotta raise your standards up a little bit. Think about it. Now here's what we are not saying, and here's what we are saying. We are not saying atheists can't be moral, they can. We are not saying atheists don't know morality, they do. Atheists can be moral. Atheists can, according to a moral code, live by it. Atheists can know what that moral code is. In fact, the Bible teaches they can. Romans chapter 2. Do you need the Bible to know right from wrong? No, the Bible teaches you don't. The Gentiles do not have the law of the law written on their hearts. Everyone knows basic right and wrong. So they can know it. They can do good things according to the moral code. But what they can't do is they can't justify morality. They can theorize about how we know murder's wrong, but atheism provides no immaterial objective standard that establishes why murder's wrong. Now give me 30 seconds of your indulgence for a second. This is an important distinction. This is what the difference that philosophers call the difference between epistemology, how you know something, and ontology, that something exists. How do you know something? Well, what the atheists try and tell me is, oh, I know morality because the society taught me it, or evolution taught me it, or my grandparents taught me, or whatever. Fine. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about how you know something. I'm talking about why is something the way it is. Why is murder wrong? If there's no God, why is murder wrong? Why not kill everybody if there's no God? There's no standard. The difference between epistemology and ontology, illustrated by mathematics. I learned the times tables from my 4th grade teacher, Mr. Fisher. That's how I became to know the times tables. But the times tables existed independently of me or Mr. Fisher, right? Before he was ever born or I ever existed, 4 times 4 equaled 16. That's ontology. The same is true with murder. Murder is wrong before I ever came to know it was wrong. And atheists have no way of justifying that. An immaterial objective standard of justice requires a theistic God. All right. From these 3 arguments, I think we can draw some conclusions. Now, I've summarized these arguments, so there may be some holes in this. You may be going, what about this, what about that? You can bring them up during the Q&A. But let's just draw conclusions so we can get to points 3 and 4. From the cosmological argument, we know this being is immaterial, timeless, and spaceless. Why? Because he created material, time, and space. From the cosmological argument, we can also see he's extremely powerful because he created out of nothing. From the teleological argument, we know he's extremely intelligent. This world was put together with extreme precision. It certainly was not put together by committee, right? It was put together by one mind. This being also has purpose. We're here for a reason. From the moral argument, we know he's absolutely morally perfect, and we also know he's personal. How do we know he's personal from the moral argument? Because you don't have a moral obligation to impersonal forces. When you go try and dunk a basketball, you're not sinning against the law of gravity. You only sin against persons. We also know this being is personal, by the way, from the cosmological argument. How so? Because to go from a state of nothing, that's what existed, nothing, no space, no matter, no time. What's a good definition of nothing? Aristotle had a good definition of nothing. He said nothing is what rocks dream about. Okay? That's nothing. There was no matter, no space, no matter, no time, what rocks dream about, and then an entire universe came into existence. To go from that state to a state of nothing, to go from a state of nothing to a state of creation, this universe, someone had to make a choice. And only persons make choices. Gravity, an impersonal force, does not decide, as I keep dropping this remote, that it's going to pull it to the ground. It's not thinking, if he drops that one more time, I'm not going to pull it to the ground. Right? It doesn't do that. It's not a personal force. That's why if you read Stephen Hawking's new book, The Grand Design, you know what he says toward the end of the book? That this universe would come into existence because we have a law like gravity. Hello, McFly. First of all, gravity was created. There was no space, no matter, no time, so there was no gravity. But secondly, gravity doesn't create anything. Gravity just describes what happens when, under a certain set of conditions. It doesn't create anything. It's an impersonal force. Now notice, we have an immaterial, timeless, spaceless, extremely powerful, extremely intelligent, purposeful, morally perfect, personal creator, and we haven't opened the Bible yet. Yet this is the God of biblical Christianity identified without reference to the Bible. We have all these attributes from these 3 arguments. That means that theism appears to be true, but this isn't the only theism out there, is it? Christianity. No, you've got Judaism, you've got Islam as well. So which theism is true? Actually, maybe none of these theisms are true. Maybe they just have theism right, but nothing else, right? That's possible. But if one of these is true, if there is a God who wanted to tell us which one of these world religions were true, what could he do that only he could do that could confirm it to us? He could do a miracle. That's point 3, okay? So what I just did was a summary of points 1 and 2. Now we'll spend more time on 3 and 4. You guys okay? All right, now we'll take a break soon. Are you guys okay right now? Okay, good. Are miracles possible? Let me ask you a question. Before there was anything like telephones or telegraphs or the internet or any of these things, like say, let's go back to the Middle Ages. When one king wanted to communicate with another king, how could he do so? Send a message, and what would be on the message? A seal, right? A seal would be on the corner of the message that would allow the receiving king to be sure that the message really came from the other king. That seal had to have at least 2 characteristics. It had to be very unique, and it had to be very difficult to forge. Otherwise, somebody could send a false message, right? Seems to me that's what miracles do. They're unique things that only God can do, and they're very difficult to forge. They can authenticate a message, in other words. And when you ask the question, miracles, why miracles? The message is confirmed by a miracle, or the miracle confirms the message. The sign confirms the sermon. How many miracles are there in the Bible? Let's just look at the Bible for a second. How many miracles are in there from, say, Moses to Jesus and the apostles? Anyone? Approximately? 836, says Jim Sr. No. Survey said, "Bang!" Nice try, though. Any of you here from The Price is Right? Higher, lower. About 300. There's about 300 miracles. Some of them are sets of miracles, but about 300. Now, if you take 300 miracles over 1,500 years from Moses to Jesus, how often do you get a miracle? Once every 5 years. But the miracles occur in the Old Testament and the New Testament once every 5 years? How do they seem to occur? They occur in clusters, right? Here are the clusters they occur in, if you notice. They occur around Moses, Elijah and Elijah, and Jesus and the apostles. Why? Because there's new revelation that needs new confirmation. There's a new message that needs a new miracle. There's a new sermon that needs a new sign. God does miracles throughout the Old and New Testaments directly, but when he does them through people, he does them in these basic time frames around Moses, Elijah and Jesus and the apostles. Why? Because these are people who have new revelation that need new confirmation. Why should we believe you, Paul, that you speak for God? Because I can do miracles. God allows me to do them. God does them through me. When Moses is at, or when Moses says to God, how is Pharaoh going to let my people go? What does God say? You'll be able to do miracles. That'll convince him. Miracles are a way confirming new revelation from God. So that's the purpose of a miracle. Now, unfortunately, in our society today, a lot of people believe miracles are impossible. For example, the Noah miracle. How can you believe the Noah story? I mean, that just seems so outlandish. I actually believe it really happened. In fact, about 4 years ago, I went to Iran with a friend of mine who's kind of a Christian Indiana Jones. His name is Bob Cornuke. I haven't even heard of Bob Cornuke. Anyone here heard of Bob Cornuke? He's kind of the Christian Indiana Jones. And we went, and we had, long story, but had some intelligence that there could be the remains of Noah's Ark in Iran. So we flew to Tehran, and we went about 55 miles northwest up into the Elburz Mountains. We got up to 13,000 feet, where we saw what we were looking for. We saw a mass of rock which we brought back and tested out and saw that some of it was petrified wood, and this massive rock looked like it could have been a ship at one point. It was 5,000 feet above the tree line, so this wasn't a bunch of fallen trees or anything, but there was no way we could prove it was Noah's Ark because it didn't say USS Noah on the side. Okay? No way of proving it. If you want more info on that, you can go to our website, crossexamined.org, and on the resource side, you'll see Bob's website. You can go read about that trip. AOL was on AOL, was on National Geographic, it was on Good Morning America. It's interesting, but we can't prove anything. other than it's a very interesting find. A lot of people, of course, think resurrections don't occur. Everyone they know who's died is still dead. Why should I believe in a resurrection? And for some reason, the big miracle in the Bible that people have trouble with is Jonah. Is that a tale of a whale or a whale of a tale? What's the deal with Jonah? Is that historical or is that hysterical? Now, by the way, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? Now, people always say the resurrection. No, the resurrection's a sissy miracle compared to the greatest miracle. What is the greatest miracle in the Bible? Yes, the greatest miracle of the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse is believable. Well, we've just given scientific evidence that the first verse of the Bible is true. That the universe did explode into being out of nothing. If that's the case, then these miracles are easy for a God who can create the universe out of nothing. Can he resurrect somebody from the dead? Can he do the Jonah miracle? Can he keep somebody alive in a great fish or kill that person in a great fish and resurrect him 3 days later? Of course! It's God. If he can create the universe out of nothing, he can do any of these things. It's easy. God can do whatever he wants that's not logically impossible. You said, I thought God can do anything. No, there are some things even God can't do. Like God can't cease being God. He can't change. These would be weaknesses if he could change. He can't make a square circle. Such a thing doesn't exist. He can't make a married bachelor. Okay? He can't make an honest politician. These things are just too hard for even God. Okay? He can't make a rock so big he can't lift it. Hey, you ever get that one? Well, if God's so powerful, why can't he make a rock so big he can't lift it? Anyone ever says that to you, just ask a couple questions. Say, how big's the rock? They're going to go, well, it's big. Well, how big is big? Really big. What do you mean by really big? Infinitely big. Now they've just gone into what logicians call a category mistake. What's the category mistake? You can't have an infinitely big finite rock. In fact, you can't have an infinitely big anything finite. They're two different categories. Any rock God can make, he can move. But even God can't make an infinite finite rock. There's no such thing. Okay, so it's just a category mistake there. The bottom line is, if the first verse of the Bible is true, every other verse is possible. Right? I'm not saying it's true at this point. I'm simply saying it's possible. We haven't proven it's true yet. I'm getting there. Now, notice also, if the New Testament documents are reliable, which I think they are, we'll get to, notice Jesus relates two of the most controversial and outlandish miracles from the Old Testament to his own life. Noah and Jonah. Do you think Jesus thought that Noah and Jonah were historical or hysterical? Historical. He referred to them directly to his own life. C.S. Lewis put it well, as he put everything well. But if we admit God, must we admit miracles? Indeed, you have no security against it. That is the bargain. That's the bargain. If God exists, miracles are possible. The only question is, have they occurred since the first one? Have there been any other miracles since in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? That's what we're going to look at. But before we do, we got to look at one individual. An individual by the name of David Hume. How many have heard of David Hume? Can I see your hands, please? Oh, this is a pretty sophisticated crowd. Because David Hume is a very influential philosopher who died in 1776. And his argument against miracles is still used in the modern university today to get people to say you ought not believe in miracles. Here's his argument. We're going to go through it. It's only going to take about 5 or 6 minutes to go through, but we need to go through it because it's important. You're going to hear this. Here's what Hume's argument said. Natural law is by definition a description of a regular occurrence. If I keep dropping this remote over and over again, I'm going to make the inductive conclusion after all this observation, I keep dropping other stuff and it all goes to the ground, that there's got to be some sort of natural law known as gravity. I just keep dropping all things and they keep going to the ground. Natural law is by definition a regular occurrence. Happens all the time, right? Point 2, Hume says a miracle is by definition a rare occurrence. If miracles occurred all the time, if resurrections occurred all the time, we'd probably consider them to be some sort of natural phenomenon. By definition, miracles have to be rare if they're going to get our attention, correct? They can't happen all the time. Third, Hume says this, the evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. We see this every Sunday when we watch a football game. The ref sees the play from one angle at full speed. We see it from 6 different angles, half speed, as many times as we want, with replay. The evidence for the regular, seeing it over and over again on replay, is better than the evidence for the rare, where you see it once at full speed from one angle. Then Hume says this: a wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. That seems axiomatic, right? You're not going to base your belief on the lesser evidence. That wouldn't make any sense. So here's Hume's conclusion then. Therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. Now, in order for us to believe in miracles, one of these first 4 premises have to be false. Which one of these false premises do you think is false? 4, a wise man bases his belief on the... No, I don't think that's false. Why would that be false? Wouldn't you base your belief on the greater evidence to be wise?
Not always, no.
Huh?
Not always.
Number 3. Why do you say number 3? I was only born once. There's a good answer right there. The problem premise is premise number 3. Okay? And here's why. The evidence for the regular events is not always greater than that for the rare. In fact, here's examples from Hume's own worldview. If Hume were here today, he would believe in the Big Bang. But the Big Bang is not based on regular events, right? It's not the Big Bang, 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 bang theory. Okay? It's the Big Bang. You only saw it once. It happened once. You can't repeat it in the laboratory. It's a singular event. Yet Hume would believe it. If Hume were here today, he would believe that the origin of life does not occur regularly. You know, Pasteur's beaker is still sterile. We never see spontaneous generation in a sterile beaker. We never see non-life coming from, or life coming from non-life spontaneously. We don't see that. But it happened somehow because we're here, right? Yet it only seemed to have happened once, yet we all believe it happened. Also, macroevolution cannot be repeated. If it happened at all, it happened only once, yet Hume would believe it. Folks in the laboratory, the scientists in the laboratory are trying to repeat macroevolution. They're trying to figure out, they're trying to take microevolution and they're trying to convert it to macroevolution. You know, through all their intelligence, they still can't do it. They run into genetic barriers all the time. There's a guy at the University of Pittsburgh who I think has gone through about 40,000 generations of E. coli bacteria trying to get them to form into another type of creature. What does he still have after 40,000 generations? E. coli bacteria. If it happened at all, it happened only once. We can't repeat it. Yet they believe it. In fact, C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, the entire history of the earth cannot be repeated. If Hume were consistent, he shouldn't believe his own birth, because it happened only once. You know, the other night when Greg Kokel was here and he stole my best line, that happened only once and will never happen again. No. That happened only once, yet you have good reason to believe it because you were here. Eyewitness evidence. According to Hume, you ought not believe it if it doesn't happen all the time. You see the problem with this particular argument? Yet people in the university still believe this. They're blinded. Maybe they want to be blinded. Okay? Notice also, this argument is really an argument against the believability of miracles. It's not an argument against the actuality of miracles or the possibility of miracles. Hume is saying you ought not believe something even if it's true. Well, that doesn't make any sense. There's got to be a problem with the theory if you ought not believe it even if it's true. You say, well, why don't more scientists believe in miracles then? This is Richard Lewontin. He is a Darwinist, an atheist, a Marxist. He's got a lot of ists after his name. He teaches at Harvard University. In 1997, he had a very candid moment when he wrote in the New York Times Review of Books. Here's what he wrote. He said, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori, meaning our prior adherence to material causes, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. He's not saying that science rules miracles out because there's some scientific reason to. He's just saying philosophically we rule miracles out. Because we don't want God involved. What happens if we get God involved? We're no longer seen as the new priests who dispense truth to the general public. We no longer get grant money for looking for reasons evolution's true. We no longer are going to be slapped on the back by our materialist colleagues at cocktail parties if we suggest miracles are possible. We're going to look like crazy fundamentalists. And by the way, if miracles are possible, that means there's a miracle worker who brings along with him a moral code, and we don't want to bow our knees to a creator. A friend of mine does a lot of lectures on college campuses at Well. He went to a college campus a number of years ago. He was invited by the biology professor to speak to his biology class, and the professor, or this guy, came in and he gave a talk on the problems with Darwinism. And after the class was over, he and the professor went to lunch. And Ron, my friend, said to this guy, he said, "What'd you think of my lecture?" And the professor said, "Well, I think what you say is true. I think there are a lot of problems with Darwinism, but I'm going to keep teaching Darwinism anyway." And Ron said, "Well, why would you do that?" And he said, "Because if we really evolved from slimy green algae, then I can sleep with whoever I want to sleep with." In other words, Darwinism's morally comfortable. And that often is the reason.
So he was slimy green algae.
He must have been slimy green algae, exactly. If we all evolved from there, yeah. In fact, just the other night at Muskegon Community College in Michigan, I was going back and forth with one guy who was telling me I was wrong over something during the Q&A, and he wouldn't say why I was wrong. So I finally asked him, I said, "Hey, if Christianity were, first of all, let me just preface it this way. If I ask you a question, will you give me an honest answer?" He said, "Sure." I said, "If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?" He said, "No." I said, "Why are we even doing this then? Why don't we just go have pizza?" How could you be so irrational that you would not believe something that was true? I had a girl at Davidson College say the same thing. She said, "No, is that a problem here or a problem here?" It's a problem here. Thomas Nagel, who teaches at NYU, says that many atheists have a cosmic authority problem. They don't want there to be a God because they don't want to bow their knees to a creator. In fact, Nagel himself, who's an atheist, said, "I don't want the universe to be that way. I don't want there to be a God." If you read Christopher Hitchens' book, and by the way, you need to pray for Christopher Hitchens. He's in very bad shape. He's got esophageal cancer. He's going through some treatment. Doesn't look good. But if you read his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, particularly the last chapter, he's just mad at God. He just says, "I will not live under this divine tyranny." He calls God a celestial dictator. So the way at the second debate I summed up the whole book, I said, you can sum up Christopher Hitchens' book in one sentence. Here it is. There is no God, and I hate him. That's basically it. He doesn't want there to be a God. He doesn't want to bow his knee to a creator. Now, are all atheists this way? Well, I don't know. I'm just telling you what I can see from what some of these atheists are saying. And what Lewontin is saying is we just rule God out because we don't want to deal with him. All right. Now, the big question. Is the New Testament and therefore the Bible true? Yes, truth exists. It's self-defeating to say it doesn't. Yes, God exists. We've got those three arguments. Are miracles possible? Yes, the greatest miracle of all has already occurred, the creation of the universe out of nothing. Now the only question is, have subsequent miracles occurred? Now, can you guys go another 20 minutes before we take a break? Is that okay? And then we'll take a break, we'll finish, and we'll do Q&A. Is that good? All right. Now, there are two questions we have to answer in order to deal with the Bible, and particularly the New Testament. Is it reliable? The first question is, do we have an accurate copy of the original New Testament documents? And the second question is, do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? The answer to question one is yes. And it's all in chapter 9 of the book. I want to spend more time on question 2. Do the original New Testament documents tell the truth? Now, some of you may say, well, what about Bart Ehrman? If you have a question about Bart Ehrman, bring it up during the Q&A and we'll deal with it then. He's a professor who tries to say that the answer to question 1 is no. He teaches at UNC Chapel Hill. But just about every other professor says yes. Anyway, let's go to question number 2. It's not enough to say we have an accurate copy, because we can have an accurate copy of a lie, right? Now, Steve has already covered some of this, particularly with regard to the Old Testament. He's already covered much of question 1, so we're just going to go right on to question 2. We want to make sure that the New Testament documents we have here actually tell us the truth. And I'm going to give you 6 lines of evidence that begin with the letter E that will show us that the New Testament documents tell us the truth. These are all in the book, chapter 10 and 11, I think. In fact, chapter 11 is the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. I'm just going to mention 6 of them and probably only really cover 4. Here are the 6. First of all, we have early testimony. I'll explain these when we get to them. Secondly, we have eyewitness testimony. Thirdly, we have embarrassing testimony. We'll get there. We also have excruciating testimony, number 4. Number 5, we have expected testimony. And number 6, we have extra-biblical testimony. Early, eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, expected, and extra-biblical testimony. Let's start with early. That's number 1. And let's go back to the first century. In the first century, there are 2 big events that occur that every historian agrees really occurred. The first is the cross. Jesus going to the cross sometime in the early 30s, whether it's 30 AD, 33 AD, somewhere in there. And the other is the temple being destroyed and the entire city of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, being overrun by the Romans in 70 AD. There is no sane historian out there who disagrees with either of these. Hardly anyone now says Jesus never existed. There's just too much evidence he did. So these 2 are very well attested facts of history. Now, what's going on in this one generation in the first century? Well, we know that Paul is killed at the hands of Nero sometime in the mid to late 60s. We have good evidence for that. Secondly, we know James, the half-brother of Jesus, is killed in 62 AD. How do we know this? Does the Bible tell us? Any Bible document? Josephus tells us, who's a Jewish historian. I think it's Hegesippus, who is a Christian historian, who tells us both, they corroborate one another, that James was killed. He was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He was killed by the Sanhedrin. He was thrown off the Temple Mount. When he hit the ground, he was still alive. They found him alive. They bludgeoned him to death right there at the temple. Now, this is the same James that apparently didn't believe Jesus was God when Jesus was on the earth before he rose from the dead. And now here in the same city, Jesus is alleged to have risen. He is the leader of the church and dies as a martyr about 30 years later. And this is, again, attested to by Josephus and Hegesippus. We know that Acts is written by 62 AD for a number of reasons. They're all in chapter 10 of the book. And we know that 1 Corinthians, everyone agrees 1 Corinthians, even atheists agree, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians in about 55 AD. And then there's a creed in 1 Corinthians that virtually every scholar agrees is prior to 40 AD. What's the creed? The most important evidence for the resurrection occurs in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. It's an ancient creed that they actually memorized right after it occurred. Paul received it and ultimately put it into writing when he wrote 1 Corinthians. And if you look at the creed, there's a rhythm to it. And in fact, Gary Habermas, who teaches at Liberty and Oxford universities, has identified 41 creeds in the New Testament documents. These are all creeds that predate the writing of the New Testament documents. They lived in an oral culture, so they memorized these things. Very short little sayings about what actually occurred. I don't have time to go into it now, but write down 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. That's a very early creed that predates even 40 AD. Many scholars say it goes all the way back to the event itself. Now, what's going on in this time frame? If Acts is written by 62, Luke is prior to that. How do we know that? Who wrote Acts? Luke. What does he say in the first verse of the book of Acts? In my former work, O excellent Theophilus. What's the former work? Luke. Many, of course, believe Mark is prior to Luke. In any event, you've got early testimony written down right here. Also, Paul, I may be going out on a limb here, but I have to say that Paul wrote all of his works before he died. What do you think? Is that fair to say? These are the undisputed works of Paul: 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, and Galatians. Yeah, he wrote others, but that's all you need to show that the resurrection really occurred. And I'm here to say that most, if not all, the New Testament's written to prior to 70 AD. All, if not most, of the New Testament, most, if not all, the New Testament written to prior to 70 AD. How do we know this? Well, one reason we know this is because there's no mention of the 70 AD events anywhere in the text. And this is a catastrophic event. The 70 AD event, well, actually it is mentioned in one place. Jesus actually predicts it. He predicts it in Matthew 24. He says, you see, before this generation passes, or he says, not one stone is going to be left upon another. And then later they say, when is this going to occur? And he says, before this generation passes away, these things will occur. When did he say that? 30 AD. When did that occur? 70 AD. What's a generation? About 40 years. Jesus actually predicts it, and yet then nobody ever comes back and says, Jesus was right. Why not? Because they had written all this by then. You say, that's just an argument from silence. No, it's not just an argument from silence. First of all, it's too big of an event to leave out. But secondly, the New Testament documents are written as if the temple and the city are still standing. Even the Gospel of John says there are colonnades in John 5:2. I think it's talking about a pool there. Well, they weren't there after 70 AD. That was all destroyed. Even the book of Revelation appears to imply that the temple is still standing when they're writing. So these are early documents. The more important point here is this is during the age of the eyewitnesses. Age of the eyewitnesses. It's very difficult for historical fact to be crowded out by historical revisionism while the eyewitnesses are still alive. Very hard for that to be done. This is during the age of the eyewitnesses. By the way, one other point on this. Suppose you were reading a book about Lower Manhattan, and it talks about the trade towers being built. And there's no mention of the trade towers being destroyed by Muslim terrorists on 9/11. When are you going to assume the book was written? Pre-9/11. Same thing seems to be true here. Nothing mentioned about one of the most disastrous events in Jewish history. Josephus, who was actually in that war, called it the greatest war of all time. In 66 AD, Josephus was surrounded by the Romans, and instead of committing suicide like his colleagues, he gave himself up to the Romans and went on to become a great historian because he won favor with the Romans. He became a great historian, the greatest historian of the time for the Jews, and he called it the greatest war of all time to that point. Thousands of villages were burned, thousands of people killed, maybe over 1 million, and nobody writing in the New Testament mentions it. Seems to strain credulity to think that they wouldn't have mentioned it if it had already happened. Early testimony. It's one thing to have early testimony, however. It's another thing to have eyewitness testimony. How do we know they really told the truth? The reason I think we can know they told the truth is because they put crosshairs in the text. Historical crosshairs in the text. I'm going to read 2 verses from a section of ancient testimony, and I want you, as I read these verses, I want you to tell me if it sounds like this writer's making up a story. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, Trachonitis, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priest of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. Does it sound like he's making up a story here? No, that's Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. He's not making up a story. An exact date is given. 29 AD. How do we know that? That was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. It'd be like me saying it was the 2nd year of the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton is the Secretary of State. Robert Gates is the Secretary of Defense. Joe Biden is the Vice President, etc. You'd know exactly what I'm talking about, right? That's what he's doing right here. All these people, all 8 people are known from history. All these people mentioned in there. They're all known to live at this exact time. This is not a once upon a time story. If Luke is trying to pass off a lie as the truth, he would have said something like, once upon a time there was a man named Jesus, or something like that. He's not going to say it was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. That's pinpointing it. Also, if you look, particularly in the book of Acts, there are 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details in the book of Acts alone, from chapter 13 to chapter 28. They're all listed in chapter 10 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. 84. Roman historian Colin Hemmer went through Acts with a fine-tooth comb and picked out all these things that are in the text that have been confirmed either by archaeology or other historical means. And Luke is very specific on some of these things. He writes down the name of a ruler in an obscure town. It's been checked out to be true. He writes down the strange language and even slang spoken there. It's been verified. He writes down the wind direction at a particular part of the Mediterranean at a particular time of the year. He writes down even the water depth off Malta when they run aground in chapter 27. We took soundings, it was 120 feet, then we took soundings again, it was 90 feet, then we cut the anchors and ran aground. It's all true. In fact, my colleague Bob Cornuke, the guy I went to Iran with, thinks he's found the anchors of a Corinthian freighter that came into Malta at that time. Could be the anchors of Paul. Now, here's the interesting thing. While Luke is recording all of these trivial details about wind directions, water depths, obscure rulers, he's also saying that Paul is doing miracles. Now, why would he lie about the big issues like miracles and be so accurate with the trivial details? Doesn't seem to make any sense that he would. Well, miracles don't occur. That's an anti-supernatural bias, which we just threw out the window with the fact that we've shown that God exists. You can't say just because something has miracles in it, it didn't occur. That's the very question. If God exists, miracles are possible. Here's what historians have said about Luke, and this is Sir William Ramsay, one of the great archaeologists of all time, put it this way. I began with a mind unfavorable to it, Acts, but more recently I found myself brought into contact with the book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne in upon me that in various details the narrative showed marvelous truth. A.N. Sherwin-White put it this way. He was a Roman historian. He said, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. The book of Acts is a diary, basically, of a journey through the Mediterranean from chapter 13 to 28, and it's all true. At least it appears to be. Verified. Secondly, there are many other of these kinds of details in Luke's gospel that he includes as well. The Gospel of John has 59 historically confirmed or historically probable eyewitness details in it. A lot of people think John is written late. Well, if it is, John has a great memory, or he's being inspired by the Holy Spirit, because he's got all sorts of eyewitness details in his gospel that have been shown to be accurate. They're all, again, in chapter 10 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And one of the things Dr. Geisser and I did is we went through the New Testament documents and found more than 30 people who have been confirmed by secular sources to have existed just like the Bible claims they are. In other words, we thought, you know, Pilate, is he mentioned anywhere outside the Bible? Are the Herods, is Caiaphas, or any of these people? Yes, they are. Here is a list, and this is not an exhaustive list, but all these people that the New Testament documents talk about really did exist according to secular history as well. Even the New Testament documents get all the Herods right. Imagine keeping that all straight. By the way, if you add Jesus to this list, you get 32, because Jesus is mentioned in 10 ancient non-Christian sources outside the New Testament within 150 years of his life, but that's probably not an exhaustive list. You say, well, how do you know these people existed? Because there are such things as archaeological evidence. This is from the coastal town of Caesarea identifying Pilate. That's on the Mediterranean. Not only do we know that Caiaphas existed, we actually have his bones. This is an ossuary. What's an ossuary? It's a Jewish burial box that the Jews used from about 20 BC to 70 AD. Since they believed in a bodily resurrection, what they would do is after somebody died, about a year after they were interred, they would exhume the remains, which were bones at that point, put the bones in this limestone box known as an ossuary, and they'd reinter the remains. Now, there have been hundreds of these ossuaries found. In 1990, they were about to build a water park near Jerusalem, and they ran a bulldozer into a cavern that had a bunch of these ossuaries in it. And one of them had on the side of it, a very ornate one, had an inscription which identified the remains as Caiaphas. Who's Caiaphas? Who was Caiaphas? High priest who sentenced Jesus to die. He stood before Jesus and said, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am." And Caiaphas said, "Blasphemy!" And he tore his robes. In the Passion, he was the one in the purple robe. He tore his robes. So not only do we know that Caiaphas existed, we have his bones. Inside were the bones of a 60-year-old man and his family. I mean, this is an incredible find. Now, you may have heard the Jesus ossuary. Have you heard of this one? James Cameron made it popular. He directed Avatar and Titanic, and he tried to say that the Jesus ossuary was Jesus of Nazareth's real ossuary. The guy who discovered the ossuary in 1980 says it has nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth. But James Cameron tried to sensationalize it for the Discovery Channel, and of course he did. But it's not the Jesus of Nazareth. Why? Because he took his bones with him. That's right. It neglects all the evidence that he rose from the dead. And secondly, you know how many Jesus ossuaries they found so far in Jerusalem? 22. 22. It's a very common name. I think it was the 5th or 7th most common name. It's really Joshua in the Palestine at the time. I mean, it's like, you know, going out to the graveyard today and seeing John on a gravestone and going, it's got to be John the Baptist. You know, it's just sensationalism. Also, we know crucifixion occurred. How so? Here's an actual heel bone of a crucified victim from the 1st century in Jerusalem. This is just a mock-up to show the relative angle of the nail going through the heel bone. There are scores of these discoveries, not of crucified victims, but I mean that corroborate the New Testament and even the Old Testament, as Steve pointed out earlier. In fact, according to U.S. News and World Report, not a Christian mouthpiece, here's what they said about archaeology. In extraordinary ways, modern archaeology has affirmed the historical core of the Old and New Testaments, corroborating key points of the stories of Israel's patriarchs, the Exodus, the Davidic monarchy, and life and times of Jesus. What? Wait a minute. Exodus. Or wait a minute. Patriarchs. That's Abraham. Exodus, that's Moses. Davidic monarchy, that's David. Life and times of Jesus. That's the whole Bible. Yeah, that's the point. Now, this guy, I think, is a Christian. He wrote a book, Is the Bible True? But this was in U.S. News and World Report. So the evidence that this is eyewitness testimony is indeed very, very strong. But we're still not totally convinced now that this testimony really is true until we get to embarrassing testimony, which we'll do after the break. All right, you guys ready to go? All right, we are in point 4. Is the New Testament true? And now we've gone through 2 of the 6 evidences for the New Testament documents being true: early testimony, eyewitness testimony. Now we're going to move on to embarrassing testimony, and this one for me is personally persuasive because this points out that these folks who wrote down the New Testament documents were not making it up, in my estimation anyway. There's a principle historians use when they're trying to figure out whether a historical writer's telling the truth. It's called the principle of embarrassment, and it goes like this: if there's something embarrassing to the author or authors, it's probably true. Why? Yeah, you're not going to make something up that makes you look bad. I mean, how many people in here will lie to make themselves look good? Most of us will. We'll do that on occasion. We will lie to make ourselves look good. Would anybody in here lie to make yourself look bad? No, you're not going to lie to make yourself look bad. Well, it turns out the New Testament writers put a lot of material into the documents which make them look bad. They had no reason to lie about it. In fact, they had every reason to hide this stuff, but they didn't. Let's take a look at what the New Testament writers put in with regard to embarrassing testimony. First of all, they are dim-witted. They fail to understand what Jesus is saying several times. I mean, they're dingbats when it comes to the mission. They just don't know what's going on, do they? Secondly, they are uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus not once, but twice in his greatest hour of need. Stay up with me and pray. Don't worry, Lord, we'll do it. What do they wind up doing? Twice. Also, they make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. Who buries Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. What did the Sanhedrin do? They were the Jewish ruling council that sentenced Jesus to die. Now, why would they make Joseph look like a good guy while they ran away and hid for fear of the Jews? And why would they put Jesus in a Jewish tomb if they're making up a story? They wouldn't put him in a Jewish tomb if they're making up a story. Because if he was in their tomb and he hadn't risen from the dead, what could they have done? They could have gone to the tomb and said, stop all this nonsense talk about a resurrection. He's dead. Look, here's the body. They didn't do that at all. What did they say instead? They said, the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Now, why is that a bad explanation? For at least two reasons. Number one, if you're a Roman guard and you fall asleep on duty, what happens to you? You're toast. Number two, if you're a Roman guard on duty and you fall asleep, how do you know what happened? What happened? The disciples came and stole the body while we were asleep. You were asleep? Yeah, that's right. Well, how do you know what happened then? Stop asking questions and just give us the money. Why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. Oh, by the way, it's not just Matthew that records that this is their explanation. For the first 150 years or so of the church, there's an ongoing argument between the Jews and the Christians. And the Jews kept saying, the disciples came and stole the body while the guards were asleep. Now, what does that imply? That the tomb was empty, right? You don't have to come up with a story for an empty tomb if he's in the tomb. So their very alibi, or their very explanation for the empty tomb, presupposes the tomb's empty. Now, what motive would the disciples have to come and steal the body anyway? That doesn't make any sense. You'll see later that makes no sense at all. They had no motive to steal the body. Also, they are rebuked. Peter is called Satan by Jesus. This is the leader of the church. You think they're making this up? Do you think Mark just said, hey, this is a good story, Pete, I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What do you say? Have him call you Satan. What's he calling me Satan for? I'm supposed to be the leader here. Also, Paul rebukes Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. In Galatians 2, Paul says, I told Peter to his face that he was wrong for trying to get the Old Testament, or trying to get the New Testament believers to obey the Old Testament law. Now, Peter's supposed to be the first pope. Now, I realize papal infallibility didn't come till much later in the Catholic Church, but the point here is if they're making up a New Testament story, if this didn't really happen, if they're trying to make up a new religion, why would they be arguing about doctrine in the text? They could make up whatever they wanted to make up. They didn't need to do this. Yet here they are arguing about a theological issue. By the way, if you notice, most of the letters, the epistles, are all about problems. Right? There's a problem in the church at Corinth, sexual immorality, so Paul writes 1 Corinthians. There's still a problem in Corinth. They don't think Paul's an apostle, so he writes 2 Corinthians. There's legalism in Galatia, in the area of Galatia, so Paul writes Galatians. There's all sorts of heresies in Colossus, so Paul writes Colossians. There's suffering all over the ancient Christian world, so Peter writes 1 Peter. If you're making up a new religion, do you have these problems? No, you say everything's fine, just come join our club. They didn't do that at all. They talked openly in the text about their problems because they were really having them. And by the way, that's another reason that these texts are still relevant for us today. You can leave aside the inspiration, which I believe in, but even if you take away the inspiration, think about it. We have the same problems in the church today. Sexual immorality. We have people denying the authenticity of the Bible and the apostles. We have people who are involved in legalism. We have people who are suffering all over the ancient world. These texts are still relevant just on the topics they cover. Also, if you notice, the New Testament writers are cowards. The leader, again, Peter, denies Christ 3 times. And the disciples run away. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away! Oh, they all run away. Who are the brave ones? Ladies. Yes, the women are the brave ones. That's right. You can give yourselves a hand. That's right. I am woman, hear me roar. Not going to run away like you sissy pants men did. By the way, who wrote this down? Men. Now, what man is going to write down that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here make that up? Would you make that up? That's what you were doing? No way. I mean, if I were making it up, I'd write something like this down. Let's see. We marched right down there and moved that sissy Roman guard out of the way. Yeah, then we saw Jesus who congratulated us on our great faith. Yeah, that sounds good. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. Right? You certainly wouldn't say you were Mr. Sissy Pants hiding for fear of the Jews. Why the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. By the way, why would you never have the women be the first witnesses in that culture? Because their testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. If you were making up the New Testament resurrection story, you'd only have the men. But all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses. Which says what? They really were, because this is too embarrassing to make up. I heard one lady say once, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? She said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. Because wives, when your man comes home from work, does he talk? I mean, can you imagine Peter comes home that Resurrection Sunday and his wife goes, hey, honey, anything happen at work today? Nah. But I heard there was a rumor. Or I heard something big happen. What? What do you mean? Well, that Jesus finally, he really did rise from the dead. Is that true? Oh, yeah, he did. You got anything to eat around here? Men don't talk, do we? Also, notice, by the way, they are doubters. Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. The women aren't, but the disciples are. Also, some are even doubtful after they see him risen. Do you see this verse right here, Matthew 28:17? What happens in Matthew 28:19? And this is called the Great Commission. Matthew 28:19 is the Great Commission. Go therefore, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. That whole thing. Well, and in that scene, 2 verses prior, some disciples are standing there doubting that it's even him. Think they made that up? You see that guy over there? Yeah, that guy over there is Jesus. Can't be Jesus. He was dead. Spear went in his side the other day. I saw the blood and water come out. I'm telling you, that guy's name is Jesus. It can't be. He was dead. I'm telling you, it's Jesus. It can't be. He was dead. It can't be him. I'm telling you it is. Well, how do you know it is? Women told me. Now, why would they be doubting? Why would they put this in the text if they're making it up? If they're making this up, nobody ever doubted. Everybody knew it was true. I think this is an authentic detail, because if I was there, I'd probably be doubting too, wouldn't you? You'd be going, come on, can't be. Also, notice there are even potentially embarrassing details about Jesus in the text. In Mark chapter 3, he's considered out of his mind by his own family who come to seize him and take him away. Well, that is real nice thing to say, isn't it? If you're making up a story about Jesus, that he's out of his mind. You want people to think that this man is the God-man, and his own family thinks he's out of his mind? Also, he's deserted by many of his followers. In John chapter 6, Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And many of the disciples say, this is a hard teaching. We can't follow this guy anymore. Hey, if I was there, I'd say the same thing. Eat your flesh and drink your blood? What are you, a cannibal? I'm not following you either. And who would have made up, eat my flesh and drink my blood? That's not a made-up detail. He's not believed in by his own brothers. In John chapter 7, it says his own brothers didn't believe in him. Very embarrassing for a rabbi not to have his own family believe in him. Now, James later believes, apparently, because as I mentioned earlier, James was killed as a martyr. He was killed as a martyr. In the very city Jesus is supposed to have risen. Which means, as it says in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, the Creed, that Jesus appeared to James. Maybe that convinced him. But when Jesus was just on the earth prior to the resurrection, James didn't believe he was God. He didn't believe his own brother was God. How many people in here have a brother, by the way? You have a brother? How many people in here have a brother who thinks he's God? Okay, you don't believe in him either, do you? Well, James didn't believe in Jesus either, but later on he did. Also, he's thought to be a deceiver. He turns off Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him. In John chapter 8, he's talking to the Jewish believers now, it says. And he's going back and forth with them, and he gets to the point and he says, He says, if you believed in Abraham, you'd believe in me because I knew Abraham. And they said, you're not even 50 years old. And you say you knew Abraham? How did you know Abraham? And he said, before Abraham was born, I am. And they picked up stones to stone him. Why did they pick up stones to stone him? Who was he claiming to be? God. What's that a quotation from? I am. It's a quotation from the Old Testament. Where? Exodus 3:14. You remember when God appeared to Charlton Heston? You remember that? Moses said to God, you want me to tell Pharaoh, let my people go? Who should I tell Pharaoh you are? And what did God say? Tell Pharaoh, I am sends you. What does I am mean? I am means the self-existent eternal one. That's who Jesus is claiming to be. That's why they picked up stones to stone him. He's claiming to be Yahweh. It amazes me there are people today that say Jesus never claimed to be God. Like Jehovah's Witnesses will come to your door and say, Jesus never claimed to be God. I always ask them the same question. I say, if Jesus never claimed to be God, why did they kill him? For saying, love your neighbor. Did you hear what he said? Yeah, I did. He said, love your neighbor. We can't tolerate that. You must die. You're not going to get killed for saying love your neighbor, but you will get killed for saying you're Yahweh, because that's blasphemy to the Jews. And if you say you're God in a Roman society, what's that called? Sedition. Why? Who's God in the Roman society? Caesar. By claiming to be God, Jesus got a double whammy from the Romans and the Jews. Look, the Jews knew what he was claiming. That's why they kept trying to pick up stones to kill him. Blasphemy. Of course he claimed to be God. In fact, I had a Jehovah's Witness come over once, and I showed that verse to him, and he said, oh, that just means I am becoming what I am becoming. I said, I don't care how you translate it. Jesus is quoting from Exodus 3:14. Really? I said, yeah, let's go look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. In other words, from Hebrew to Greek. And we looked at the words in John 8:58, ego eimi. You don't even have to know Greek to do this. You can just look at the letters and see it's the same word. You can see ego eimi, I am, in Greek. And then we went back to Septuagint, Exodus 3:14. Same words, ego eimi. I don't care if you translate, I am a Great Dane. Jesus is claiming the same name God has. I don't care how you translate it. It's the same two Greek words. He's claiming to be equal with God. So the Jehovah's Witness guy's looking at that. And then he left and he never came back. All he can do is plant a seed at that point, right? Also, he's called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And he's crucified despite the fact that anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse, according to Deuteronomy 21:23. If you're making up a Messiah to the Jews, you don't hang him on a tree. Why not? Because he's under God's curse. This is not the Messiah they were looking for. So you don't make this kind of thing up. But Jesus really was under God's curse. Why? The curses that we put him under because of our sin. But if you're making this up, you don't say that. Yet this is what they said. They put him on a tree. So that's embarrassing testimony. There's more of this in the book, I believe. But let's move on now to excruciating testimony. It's hard for me to believe that they made all this up and said it was true when it really wasn't. There's early eyewitness, embarrassing. Now let's look at excruciating. And this goes to the point that many of the New Testament writers and the apostles, of course, went to their deaths for what they said they saw. This, of course, is a painting of Peter being crucified upside down. We have pretty good evidence that many of these folks did die, martyrs' deaths. We have very good evidence, actually. But before we look at this, let's look at the apostles' beliefs before and after the resurrection. Oh, by the way, where does that word excruciating come from? It means out of the cross in English. It's really where we get it. We get it from the crucifixion. In any event, let's look at the apostles' beliefs before and after the resurrection. Before the resurrection, the apostles believed in animal sacrifice. Remember, the apostles, the folks who wrote this down, were Jews. The only one that we don't think was a Jew was Luke. The rest of them are all Jews. So these are folks that thought they had a relationship with the God of the universe, a unique relationship, and that they were God's chosen people. And beforehand, they believed in animal sacrifice. Afterward, they believed in Christ's sacrifice. That's sufficient. Before, they believed in a binding law of Moses. Afterward, they said, you know what? Christ's life will suffice. Christ will live the perfect life, and that will basically fulfill the binding law of Moses. It doesn't bind us anymore. Before, they believed in strict monotheism. Afterwards, they believed in a Trinity. 3 persons in one divine essence. Yes, I know the Trinity is hinted at in the Old Testament, but I think it's much clearer in the New. Before, they believed in the Sabbath. In fact, they thought they could be stoned for not obeying the Sabbath. Afterwards, they believed in Sunday worship. Before, they believed in a conquering Messiah. Afterward, they believed in a sacrificial Messiah. Before, they believed in circumcision. Afterwards, they said, no, just baptism and communion will suffice. Now, here's my question for you. What would have caused these pious Jews who thought they had a unique relationship with the God of the universe to change their beliefs virtually overnight from the column on the left to the column on the right? What would have caused them to do this? A resurrection, I think. Only an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is something that impacts you so greatly psychologically and intellectually and emotionally that it causes you maybe to do a 180-degree turn. An example of an impact event might be something like a heart attack. Before a heart attack, the guy is not eating right, he's not exercising, he's smoking, he's doing all the wrong things. Suddenly, after the heart attack, he's Jack LaLanne. And some of you going, who's Jack LaLanne? Jack LaLanne's an old fitness buff from the 50s and 60s, and if he were here today, he'd still kick most of our fannies in here. Last time I saw him, he was towing a boat with his teeth across the San Francisco Bay when he was 93 years old. That was 2 years ago, right? But the heart attack victim had an impact event, and now he's a health buff, right? Some impact events will impact you so greatly you will remember everything about the event till the day you die. You will remember everything you were doing, where you were standing, what other people were doing, where they were standing or sitting, what they were saying, what you were saying, till the day you die. Only some of you will be able to answer this question. Some of you won't because you weren't born yet, but where were you November 22nd, 1963? Where were you, man? 6th grade, Mr. Hartnett's class. Yes, sir?
7th grade, between study hall and band.
7th or 8th grade between study hall or band.
Driving in a car, listening to the radio, sitting in the back seat, 4 years old.
Driving in the car, listening to the radio, sitting in the back seat, 4 years old. Yes, ma'am. You lived in Germany. You had just been to the movies and came out of the movies because it's later in Germany than it is here, and you heard about it. What happened November 22nd, 1963? C.S. Lewis died. He did. He died the same day John F. Kennedy died. You didn't know that? So did Aldous Huxley, same day. That's why Peter Kreeft wrote a book where the 3 of them are having a discussion in the afterlife. Huxley, Kennedy, and C.S. Lewis. But no, John F. Kennedy died. It's my earliest memory. I was only 2 years old. I was 2 years old in 2 days. And I can remember my mother, I'm standing in the living room, and my mother is sitting in front of the TV weeping uncontrollably. Mommy, what happened? They killed the president. They killed the president. I can still see her right there, right now, like it was yesterday. And that was 46, almost 47 years ago. Where were you when the Challenger exploded? You know where you were and what you were doing. I was in Moffett Field, California under flight training. Walked into a house that I was renting with a couple other pilots. They had the TV on. I said, hey, what's going on? They said, the Challenger just exploded. I looked at the TV. President Reagan is looking in the air like this. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? You knew where you were and what you were doing, don't you? I was on the phone, and a guy had called me in northern Charlotte, wanted me to come speak at his church, I had my back to the TV. I said, hey, you got the TV on? He goes, yeah, did you see that? Yeah, I wonder what that is. Your trade tower's on fire and everything. He said, another plane just hit the tower. I said, what? I turned around, the tower's on fire. I said, you just saw that? He said, yeah. I said, I'll call you back. So I went inside, and for some reason, I don't know why, but I had CNN on, the Communist News Network. And I don't know who the commentator was, but I'm not kidding you. Here's what the commentator said after the second plane hit the tower. He said, one has to think there's some sort of navigational error. I said, you doofus. Navigational error. If a crystal clear day, please. 2 jumbo jets? I don't think so. I later called the guy the next day. I said, we're going to come to your church and talk about Islam. This is terrorism, obviously. You remember where you were and what you were doing. Okay, question. Where were you? Well, 9/11 was, what, a little over 9 years ago? Where were you September 11th, 2010? You have no idea why. No impact event that day. No impact event. Do you think a resurrection would have been an impact event? Do you think if it really happened, they would have remembered it? And remembered everything he was saying and remember everything they were doing and saying? Do you think it may have changed them from the column on the left to the column on the right? Very easily. That's what an impact event does. If the resurrection happened, that's what it would have done. And that's what happened. This seems to be evidence for the resurrection. In fact, a lot of times I'll ask people, what did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they have to gain? What did they get temporally by saying Jesus rose from the dead? They got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks. Hey, we're going to start a new religion. We are? What's it going to get us? It's going to get us beaten, tortured, and killed. Well, sign me up! Why haven't we thought of this earlier? What a great idea. No, they're not making this up. In fact, the New Testament writers had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. What motive did they have to say this happened? They were Jews. They didn't have any motive to say this happened. Here's what I want to try and communicate as clearly as I can, because a lot of people will look at this book and say this is a religious book written by religious writers who had an axe to grind. They're biased, in other words. They had an agenda, right? Well, first of all, let me point something out. Every writer has an agenda. People don't write randomly, okay? Secondly, because somebody has an agenda doesn't mean they're lying. In fact, some people may have an agenda that they think about and value so much, it may force them to be more accurate than less accurate so as not to risk you dismissing their message. Holocaust survivors had an agenda, didn't they? They wanted to tell the world what happened because they felt so strongly about it, they didn't want it to happen again. Does that mean we can't trust them because they had an agenda? The New Testament documents were written down by eyewitnesses who wanted to tell the world about what happened. They were the eyewitnesses. They had every temporal reason to say it didn't happen, not every temporal reason to say it did. So people always ask me, well, do you have other non-Christian writers that say the same things as if they're more credible? I'll say the answer is yes. None of these other non-Christian writers are eyewitnesses, by the way. But yes, there are 10 ancient non-Christian sources outside of Jesus and the apostles within 150 years of his life that write about these things. That's actually point 6 here. Extra biblical testimony. But if you had none of them, this is who you ought to go to for what really happened. These people had every motive temporally to say this didn't happen, and yet they wrote it down anyway and then suffered brutally for it. Last week a call came into our radio program and the guy was a Muslim. And I was talking about how do we know the New Testament's true, and he basically got on there and said, well, the New Testament isn't true, and he tried to bring up a contradiction, which I quickly said it's not a contradiction, here's why. And I said, let me ask you a question. I said, why do you think that we ought to trust the Quran as to what happened to Jesus and the apostles, which was written 600 years after the events, rather than the eyewitnesses who were with Jesus and saw him? Why should we trust the Quran, a document that comes 600 years later, and not the eyewitnesses? Well, he couldn't answer that. And I said, also, if you look at the Quran, in Surah 4, which is a chapter of the Quran, Surah 4, verse 157, it says Jesus never died. So, of course, he couldn't have risen from the dead. Somebody was substituted for Jesus on the cross. Jesus was taken straight to heaven, according to the Quran. Of course, the Bible, as you know, says Jesus died and rose again. But in Surah 5, the very next chapter, it says, O ye people of the book, ye have no ground to stand on, except unless ye stand on the law and the Gospels. In other words, Allah in the Quran is telling people of the book, they're the Bible believers, the Christians and the Jews, that you ought to obey the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Gospels, and all the revelation that has come to you from your Lord. So my question to the Muslim, and this is a question you ought to use too, it's Surah 5, verse 68. Just ask any Muslim, why does the Quran in one chapter say Jesus never rose from the dead, and then in the very next chapter says that Christians and Jews ought to believe what the Bible says? Because the Bible says Jesus did rise from the dead. So how can this be? I've never had a Muslim answer this question. They don't know how to answer it because there's no way to answer it. Why would the Quran say obey the Bible? Yet the Quran contradicts the Bible, in other words. Go to the eyewitness sources. Stop looking at this book. If you're a historian, don't look at this book as a religious writing, per se, as if somebody was trying to pass off a lie as the truth. Look at this book as a collection of documents, which is what it is, about events that occurred in history, and put the tests on it that we've put on it to see if they're telling the truth. That's all you need to do. But don't look at this book, well, you can't trust the Bible because it's the Bible. What kind of sense is that? Also, why would they die for a known lie? Why would they die for a known lie? You say, wait a minute, if you're going to say that martyrdom proves Christianity, doesn't martyrdom prove other worldviews like Islam? You just told us that Islam isn't true, yet they have martyrs too. So you can't use this argument for your worldview. Can we all agree that martyrs sincerely believe in their cause? Of course. But there's a lot of differences between the Muslim martyrs of today and the New Testament martyrs of the first century. The biggest difference for our purposes is this. The Muslim martyrs are not eyewitnesses to anything. They just have faith they're going to get the 72 virgins or whatever if they fly a plane into a building. But the New Testament martyrs, the New Testament eyewitnesses, were eyewitnesses to Jesus themselves. They saw Jesus. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They knew with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. They just didn't have faith. They had the best empirical proof they could have. They were there. You see, many people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not. And they went to their deaths anyway. Surely one of them would have cracked. All of them would have cracked if it wasn't true. And they were in a position to know themselves, all right? Now, expected testimony has to do with Old Testament prophecy. I don't have time to get into this now. There's a whole chapter on it, chapter 13. But let me just point out one prophecy, and you only need one. We go into many in the chapter 13, but you really only need one. If I only had one Old Testament prophecy to go to show you there's a supernatural element to the Old Testament, it would be Isaiah 53. If you haven't read Isaiah 53 yet, write it down and go read it tonight. In fact, start in chapter 52, verse 9 or so, and go to the end of chapter 53. Or you can just get the book. It's in chapter 13. When you read that, you realize this is certainly pointing to Jesus. In fact, we know this was written prior to Christ. Why? Because it's the greatest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The entire book of Isaiah is 24 feet long. It's in the Book of the Shrine Museum in Jerusalem. They found the entire book of Isaiah, including Isaiah chapter 53, right in there where it should be. And we know that scroll dates to about 100 BC. The book itself is much earlier, but that particular scroll on that particular parchment goes to 100 BC. So if you had no other Old Testament prophecy, that would be all you need. With regard to extra biblical testimony, I've been hinting at that, mentioning to you there are 10 ancient non-Christian sources. They're all in chapter 10 of the book, or chapter 9 of the book. And basically they give a story congruent with the New Testament. When you take their very brief references to Jesus and the apostles and what happened to them, you get a story congruent with the New Testament. Again, if you had none of this, it wouldn't matter, because you've got great eyewitness testimony right there in the New Testament text. But this just adds more of it to it. Obviously, Jesus had, or the folks who say Jesus never existed, even if someone illegitimately throws out all of the New Testament documents and says, what evidence do you have that Jesus existed? You'd still have these people. Did they make up Jesus when they weren't even believers in Christ? Why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense either. All right, let's summarize this whole thing. We have early eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, expected, and extra biblical testimony. There are 4 more reasons in the book too. The conclusion here is that the New Testament is historically reliable. It is fact, not fiction. If it says Jesus said it, then Jesus really said it. If it says Jesus did it, then Jesus really did it. So let's look at the whole argument. Does truth exist? Yes. It's self-defeating to say it doesn't. Does God exist? Yes, the 3 arguments we talked about, and there are many other arguments, cosmological, teleological, and moral argument, show us we have a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator out there, which means, number 3, miracles are possible because the greatest miracle of all has already occurred, creation. The only question now is, have any other miracles occurred? And that's where we go to the New Testament, early eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating, expected, and extra biblical testimony. And there's more in the book, as you can see. So is the New Testament true? Is the Bible true? Yes, I think it is. Are there any errors in it? No, I don't think. Well, there may be one. People don't know, but there was a hidden camera at Mount Sinai, for those of you who don't know. I'll need sound for this. Check this out.
Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me. Oh, hear me. All pay heed. The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 10 commandments for all to obey.
That Moses was a quick thinker, wasn't he? Said, I'm not going back up there. He was mad. That, of course, is Mel Brooks, ladies and gentlemen. So it's true. So what? I can't say this any better than C.S. Lewis, so I'll just let him say it. This is from Mere Christianity. Who is Jesus? Here's what Lewis said. I'm trying to prevent here anyone from saying the really foolish things that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He'd rather be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God, but let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. How many have read Mere Christianity? Okay, the rest of you who haven't read it, go get it and read it. A great book, and deals largely with the moral argument, but then gets into other cardinal virtues of Christianity. So you need to check it out. So, why did Jesus come? Actually, he tells us why he came. In Mark chapter 10, it says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." You say, a ransom? I don't need anybody to pay a ransom for me. I'm a pretty good person. I can get to God on my own. You see, that reflects, I think, an error in our thinking. This is our relative moral standard that we have in our country. We have a relative moral standard from the moral midget Hitler to the moral giant Mother Teresa. And then next to Hitler, we put criminals. We know they're not quite as bad as Hitler, but they're bad. And then next to criminals, we put all the immoral people that you and I both know. You know, our immoral friends and relatives who aren't quite as good as we are, because we put our picture right here next to Mother Teresa. We know we're not quite as good as her yet, but we're working on it. but we're certainly better than our immoral friends and relatives. And then what we do is we draw a line right down between here, and we, if we believe in heaven and hell at all, say these are the bad people, they're going to hell, and these are the good people, we're going to heaven. Mother Teresa and me, okay? Well, that's not the way the world really works. The line does not go up and down. The line actually goes across the top, and the point here is that all have fallen short of the standard. From Hitler to Mother Teresa and everyone in between, we've all fallen short. And what Christ comes is he comes and his perfect life bridges the gap between our iniquity and God's perfect justice. God would be unjust if he didn't punish sin, so he has punished sin in Christ. And all we can do is accept the free gift of eternal salvation that he's given us. There's nothing else you can do. In fact, the purpose of his life was to be punished in your place, so his life was a gift to you. Have you received his gift? If so, does anyone know it? Or are you an undercover Christian? If somebody were to drag you in a courtroom like they do in Pakistan now and try and convict you of being a Christian, would you be acquitted or would you be convicted? Hopefully guilty. If people don't know you're a Christian, that's a problem. So let's go back to where we began. What's the purpose of your life? Is it a glorified Monopoly game? You know, the purpose of your life is the same purpose for which Harvard University began. Harvard University, that liberal institution up in Massachusetts? Are you kidding me? No way! You remember John Harvard was a clergyman. And it's hard to find their original charter, but here is their original charter, 1636. They try and hide it now, but this is it. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, John 17:3. And therefore, to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning. The purpose of this life is to know God and to make him known. And when I say know, I don't just mean intellectually. I mean volitionally. See, there's a confusion that many people have when it comes to faith. There are two kinds of faith, there are two kinds of belief. There's belief in and belief that. Belief that is the mind. You have to get evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that Christianity is true. But all the belief that in the world won't save you. Even the Bible in James chapter 2 says even the demons believe that God exists, but they don't put their trust in him. The difference is belief that to belief in requires a step of the heart, a step of the will. When we do apologetics, we're dealing with belief that. We're not dealing with belief in. When the Bible talks about faith, it's talking about belief in. It's not talking about belief that. Will you put your trust in Christ? Give you an example. I mean, when I first met my wife, I had to get evidence that she would be a good wife. But all the evidence in the world didn't make her my wife. I had to take a step of faith or trust in her to ask her to be my wife. And you know marriage is an illustration of our union to Christ? You have to say, I do. God is not going to force anybody into heaven against their will. If you don't want to be in heaven, you won't be there. What is hell? Separation from God. Christopher Hitchens, in the end of his book, says, I will not live under this divine tyranny. He doesn't want God now on earth. God's not going to force himself into, or force Hitchens into his presence, God's presence, in eternity either. Hitchens himself admits heaven would be hell to him. He doesn't want God. So people won't have God in hell. So there's a difference between belief in and belief that, or belief that and belief in. Everybody in this room has the same mission, to know God and to make him known. Now, you may make him known in different ways than I do. You know people I'll never know. You have skills I'll never have. You have gifts I'll never have. Maybe I know people you don't know. Maybe I have gifts that you don't have. That's why we have a body. What is the purpose of the church? It says it in Ephesians 4, to equip the saints to do ministry. That's the purpose. Pastor Wally's not supposed to do all the ministry. He's supposed to equip you to do it. That's why everybody in here has a divine purpose. By the way, that's why this discipleship program is so great. Because he's discipling others to go out there and do ministry. Everything you do every day has an impact in time and on eternity. Your life is not a glorified Monopoly game. Everything you do matters. On one hand, that's exciting. On the other hand, it's terrifying, right? Everything you do every day matters. That's why you got to stay close to the Son. S-O-N. Abide in me. Everything you do matters every day. And by the way, for those of you who are not in full-time ministry, you are. Oh, you may not be getting a paycheck from a church or a ministry, but wherever you are, God needs you. You're going to reach people that folks who work in church never will. You need to be right where you are. If we took all the Christians out of the world and put them into full-time ministry, paid ministry, that would be a disaster. I'm not even in full-time paid ministry. I do other work too. Not that there's anything wrong with being in full-time paid ministry. I'm just saying. God is more worried about where you are, or who you are where you are, than where you are. Now, if you really feel a calling to go into full-time paid ministry, that's fine. I don't want to discourage you for that. But I'm just saying, if you don't think you're worth anything where you are, you're wrong. You need to be where you are, being salt and light where you are. All right. Look at Harvard's early motto was truth for Christ and the church. Man, they've fallen away for that. Anyway, the book is available over there. There are also DVDs, as I mentioned, which go into a lot more depth. Don't forget our website, crossexamine.org. You can sign up for our blog and email there. We'll send you one email every 6 weeks or so that'll tell you what we're doing, and we're not giving your email to anyone else. There's the radio and there's the TV. You know about the book and the DVDs. Let me just tell you about this one other book. This book called Correct, Not Politically Correct, on a very controversial topic. It's Correct, Not Politically Correct, How Same-Sex Marriage Hurts Everyone. A number of years ago, I had a friend who I grew up next to who got involved in the homosexual lifestyle. We buried him at the age of 36, dead from AIDS. A lot of people think that when you say to somebody who's struggling with these same-sex desires that you're supporting them when you say, I'm with you. No, you're not. You're not supporting them. You're not loving people by telling them to continue to go down a path that can be so destructive. It's unloving. It's cowardly. I was down a couple of weeks ago at the Values Voter Conference, and I gave a talk on the case for Christians being involved in politics. And a doctor came up to me afterwards, and he said he had a patient of his that recently came out of the closet and said he was a homosexual. And the guy said to the doctor, "You're going to support my decision, aren't you?" And the doctor said, "No, I don't desert my patients like that." He said, "Whoa, that took some guts." Yeah, sometimes you got to tell the truth, even at the risk of being hated. If you truly love people, you'll tell them the truth. This book does not go into the biblical arguments against same-sex marriage or homosexuality. It deals with the common sense moral law arguments against it. It deals with born that way and discrimination and equal rights and all that. So it's a very easy book. It'll take you 2 hours to read it. Maybe some of you 3 hours. It's got an executive summary in the back. It's a real easy read, and hopefully you can use it because this is a very sensitive issue. Oh, one last thing. This issue in particular, if there's one political issue right now that can stop the gospel dead in its tracks, it's same-sex marriage. You say, how so? Because wherever same-sex marriage is put into place, the Bible becomes hate speech, and pastors and Christians become bigots. None of that's true, but that's the practical effect of it. If you don't think so, go to Sweden, where they've already jailed pastors. Go to Canada, where when James Dobson wants to do a radio program on homosexuality, he has to edit it before he sends it up there. Because he can be brought up on charges if he says anything negative about homosexuality. And there's a number of things going on in Massachusetts right now which should get your attention. Christians are being persecuted simply for believing the truth. Sorry for that cheery news. But you know, Christians, this country would be in a lot better shape if Christians just did what we were called to do. I wrote a column last year. It's on our website. It's also on townhall.com. Country a mess, blame the church. You know who's to blame? We are. We're to blame. If we had been following the Great Commission, if we had been loving the Lord your God with all our heart, soul, and mind, if we'd been always been ready to give an answer, 1 Peter 3:15, if we'd been engaging the culture, being salt and light, we wouldn't have the current culture we have now. We're the problem, which means what? We're also the solution. You can make a difference. All right, does anyone have any questions? And since no one likes to ask the first question, move right on to the second question. Second question, do we have those microphones?
I got.
Microphones are coming.
Am I on?
Who's got one? Oh, Steve's got one. Go
I
ahead,
got the
sir.
mic, so I get the first question.
Yes, sir. Second question.
Actually, I have a couple announcements before I ask the first question. Don't forget the May conference, because I know when Q&A is done, everyone's going to get up and run. Also, we have services here tomorrow morning, 8:30 and 11, if anyone's looking for a place to worship tomorrow. And if a couple of the members of the church could stay and help clean up a little bit, we just got to pick up the tables and such. The chairs are staying down. I'd appreciate it. Okay, someone handed me a question before you even started. That's weird. Here's the question. Is God evil to create an existence where millions of people would spend eternity in hell? I'm not saying that God is responsible for people choosing hell, but since he's omniscient and knew the effects, in other words, he knew that when he created it, millions of people would go to hell. Does that make him evil for choosing to create anyway?
Okay, good question. Let me point out one thing about the fact that when God creates a world and he knows people are going to hell, he doesn't do so against their free will. So I think the questioner realized that. But secondly, how many people in here consider themselves believers? Does anybody in here know? Well, you don't even have to know. Do you think anybody in your ancestral line were not believers? I know that. You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for atheists or non-believers, right? I mean, there are people in your bloodline who weren't believers. You wouldn't even be here. So that's one answer to it. The second answer is the fact that God is ultimately giving people what they freely choose. If they freely choose not to be in his presence, then God gives them separation. That's what hell is. People say, does God destroy evil in the end? No, he doesn't. He quarantines evil. It's called hell. There's another way of dealing with this, and I've never seen this done any better in 2 minutes than this short video I'm about to show you. And I want to show you this video. It's called a kinetic video. There's no video in it. There are just images. And you have to watch extremely closely because there's a lot going on. Are you guys ready? It's 1 minute and 46 seconds. It was put together by a friend of mine he's a graduate of Southern Evangelical Seminary, and it's Is God Good? Watch closely because this answers a lot of questions about evil. You ready? Okay, here we go.
Is God good? If he is, why is there suffering and evil? Let's assume for the moment that God is all-powerful. This means that God can do anything that is logically possible. So he can create galaxies and subatomic particles and rainforests and you. But God cannot do what is logically impossible. He cannot make a square circle or a one-ended stick. So can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. So what if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing, but if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God. Because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people. The first humans endowed with the awesome power of free choice abused their freedom. The tragic consequences of their bad choice and our bad choices ripple across the world. God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but humans are responsible for their acts of freedom. But let's remember, we don't suffer alone. God will put an end to suffering and evil. and God became a man to suffer with us. God is good, and he wants real people like you to know him, but the free choice is yours.
Good stuff? You can see that again if you want, as I know you probably do. I had to watch it like 5 times before I got everything going on in there. Go to our website, crossexamined.org, and look on the blog. Look for Is God Good? Okay, that's that. We're going to try and raise some money to do a bunch more of these. So you'll be able to, if someone ever asks you a question, just send somebody a link and just say, here, watch this. This will explain it better than I can. Of course, these cost several $1,000s to do. There's a lot of man hours in there, so it's going to be a while before we raise enough money to do 10 or 20 of these things, but that's what we're going to try and do. All right, who has the microphone now? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, how do you respond to someone who says, well, the Bible was put together at the Council of Nicaea and all the books weren't included, and they just picked out the books that they felt should go together?
Okay, well, first of all, that's really sort of a question about canonicity, but canonicity is not required for the resurrection, as you can see. Whether or not the books that we have currently are all the books that should be in the Bible is really not an issue for whether or not Christianity is true. It's an issue for Christian theology, but it's not an issue to figure out whether the basics of Christianity are true. But let's deal with the question directly. First of all, the canon is a list of authoritative books more than it is an authoritative list of books. What does that mean? It means the only books that are inspired are the ones God inspired, not the ones the church determined were inspired. People tried to discover what books were inspired. They didn't determine what books were inspired. And how did they discover which books were inspired? They had some criteria. First of all, was it written by a prophet of God? Normally a prophet of God had the ability to do miracles for a short period of time that authenticated that individual as a prophet. So was the writer confirmed by acts of God or someone who is confirmed as an eyewitness? For example, Paul confirmed Luke. Luke was not an eyewitness himself, at least it doesn't appear that he was, but Paul confirmed him and said he is writing good testimony. Was it accepted by the people of God? And if you look, you don't need to go to the Council of Nicaea. We have it in one of the chapters of the book where just about all the books of the New Testament, 23 out of 27, were accepted by like 100 AD. I mean, this is not very late in the development of Christianity. Were accepted by the people. They were quoted by the people of God. Okay? Remember, the Council of Nicaea came in the 4th century because for the first 280 or so years of Christianity, Christianity was on the run. It was illegal. They were persecuted. It wasn't until Constantine made Christianity tolerable, did not make it the official religion of the Roman Empire. He made it tolerable in about 311 AD. Were Christians able to freely move around the Roman Empire? Also, here's confirmation of the authorship and authority of the New Testament. The Gospels and the Acts are cited during the lives of the apostles. In fact, Peter quotes Paul's writings as being scripture, and Paul quotes Luke's writings as being scripture, so they're even quoting one another while they're writing their own documents. They're quoted as authoritative and unique. They're collected early in one volume, these New Testament documents that we have now. They're publicly read and expounded. The other so-called Gospels were not. Commentaries were written on these. Opponents even admitted that the Gospels were written by the disciples, and no other Gospels were treated this way. Okay, so these early Christians recognized really what was from God as opposed to what wasn't. You say, what about all these other Gospels like Peter and Judas and the ones that are really sensationalized in the media and by the Da Vinci Code? All of them are known to be 2nd century works. See, here's the way plagiarism works today. You write something good, I steal it from you, and I put my name on it and take all the credit. You know the way they did it back then? The writer would write something that they wanted to pass off, but they would steal an apostle's name and put the apostle's name on it. So the Gospel of Peter wasn't written by Peter, but they wanted the people to think it was, which says what? This is kind of a backhanded compliment or a backhanded admission that the people would only accept a writing from an apostle. That's why they had to take apostle or eyewitness names and put them on these forgeries, so people would believe them. So you get the Gospel of Thomas, you get the Gospel of Judas, you get the Gospel of Peter. All these things, the Da Vinci Code said, well, why did the church choose the Gospels we have and not these? Were because everyone knew they were forgeries because they were written 100 years later. Peter, Judas, Thomas were all dead for 100 years. They couldn't have written those. So the books that we have now are the books that should be in the Bible. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Do you have a mic? It's coming. Stand by or sit by.
I'm from the D.C. metro area, and Islam is growing there. Surah 568 that you mentioned was a good zinger. Do you have some more that you could give us?
Well, go to our website, crossexamine.org, or you can remember answering-islam.org. Little dash in there, answering-islam.org, and there's plenty of ammunition there. My co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, wrote a book called Answering Islam with Abdul Salib, a converted Muslim to Christianity, and that's a good book too. But if you want to go on the web, answeringislam.org. Okay. Who has the mic? Whoever has the mic. Yes, sir. And then we'll go back there.
Is it on?
Yes, sir.
You quoted and mentioned C.S. Lewis quite a bit, and some of the reading I've been doing by G.K. Chesterton, and he wrote The Everlasting Man,
Yes.
which Lewis wrote, and what convinced him to become a Christian. I'm wondering, there's a website on it. I mean, there's also a program on TV, but my question to you is, what are your thoughts on G.K. Chesterton, and expound on that, please.
I have not read a lot of Chesterton. I started to read Orthodoxy. A lot of people loved Orthodoxy. I didn't find much to Orthodoxy, so I got halfway through it and put it down. But Chesterton has some great quotes. One of the greatest quotes Chesterton ever had was, there was an editorial that back 100 or so years ago, the paper put out a question, what's wrong with the world today? And people were supposed to write in and tell everybody what was wrong with the world today. And Chesterton wrote, what's wrong with the world today? I am. Signed G.K. Chesterton. Just admitting that he's a sinner, you know. Oh, there's some great things Chesterton said, but I don't know. I'm not a Chesterton scholar, so I'm not the guy to ask on that. Yes, sir.
Yes. Hi, Frank. Terry Johnson, Aberdeen, Maryland. I have a question. And
yes, sir.
A comment and a question.
Yes, sir.
The first comment would be that I think you said that eyewitnesses wouldn't die for a lie. Did you
a
say
known
that?
lie.
A known lie.
Yeah.
Well, like I think about the court systems here. I watch a lot of court TV, forensics files, and they bring people in court all the time, and they show them, we got you, we got you. We don't have it on camera, but here's all the stuff. You know you did it. Did you do it? And they say no. And they, especially in Texas, they'll say kill them. You know, so it seems to me like eyewitnesses would die for a lie. But that's just a comment.
Well, no, are you saying then that the people who are accused of a murder won't admit to it?
They won't admit to it at the time that they're at the trial, and then even post 10, 20 years later, they'll ask them again, look, you're in prison. We can't do anything about it now. Did you really kill that guy? We have all this evidence. We know you did it. You know you did it. Did you do it? No, I didn't do it.
Well, how do we know they did do it?
Well, the evidence points that way. It seems reasonable and very plausible that they did it. There may not be any eyewitnesses to it, but it seems to me, and it seems to other jurors also and judges, that they did it. Now, maybe they didn't do it. Maybe an alien did it or something else.
Well, no, maybe they did do it, but maybe they're just criminals who won't admit it. The New Testament writers and the apostles were not criminals.
Oh no, I'm not.
They're all 12 of them would have, or 11 out of 12, whatever. I mean, they wouldn't have lied at the point of death, continuing for what motive? You know, this guy's in prison. What does he have to lose by saying he did do it? Nothing. You know, zero. But someone who is about to kill you or recant Christianity and they don't recant, they really believe it. They could walk out of jail and walk free in society by saying Jesus didn't rise from the dead. They would have, but none of them did.
Yeah, no, I'm just making a comment about the basic notion that an eyewitness would not die for a lie. And all I'm saying is, well, it seems the case that it seems to the point that they would. And
I mean, you might be able to find an isolated case, but you're not going to find 11 out of 12. It's a probability argument, of course.
Okay.
But go ahead, go on with your question.
My question is this. My question is, when you look at the, taking the criteria that you applied, early testimony, eyewitness testimony, embarrassing, excruciating, that sort of thing, do you know if there's been anybody out there who's taken those type of criteria and applied them to, like, the Quran or the Gita or, you know, other sacred texts out there and have concluded that, hey, it seems pretty reasonable that this is a reliable document and that these things did happen?
Well, let's take the Quran, for example. That's a good question. There's a lot in the Quran that's true. There's a lot of history in the Quran that can be verified. But notice Muhammad, even in the Quran, when he's asked, do a miracle to show you're a prophet of God, he says, I do no miracle, all I give you is the Quran. Well, if writing a book makes you a miracle worker, I've done 3 miracles, okay? The Quran has no supernatural authenticity for it, or no supernatural authentication for it. The miracles that are attributed to Muhammad come 100 to 150 years later in what is known as the Hadith, the written traditions of Muhammad, sayings of Muhammad. And even many Muslim scholars agree that many of the supposed miracles are not true. They're exaggerations. Some of these miracles have wolves saluting Muhammad, mountains saluting Muhammad. Some of them are clear rip-offs of the Bible, where Muhammad feeds thousands, just like where Jesus feeds 5,000, Muhammad feeds 50,000. Jesus turns water into wine, Muhammad turns water into milk, okay? These are not eyewitness accounts. So while you can look at the Quran for historical information, and there is much historical information in there, I don't think there's anything supernatural nor any miracles occurring in the Quran that can be authenticated by eyewitnesses. Where is the microphone now? Just raise your hand wherever it is. Yes, sir, in the back. Go ahead, and then we'll come up here. I'm sorry. All right, go ahead, sir. Whoever spit first.
First and foremost, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Mike Larakis from South Jersey.
Forget about it.
A couple of comments. The Harvard crest has Veritas right on it, which means truth.
Yes.
And clearly they've gotten away from the truth in the last 300 years.
Yes, sir.
As have all the other Ivy League universities. Another comment. I loved your Genesis 1:1 account and the parallels that you draw with it with the astronomy and so forth of the Big Bang Theory. One of the things that I always point out in my witnessing to people about the Big Bang is that bang is probably not the correct word because space is a vacuum and there is no noise. I usually say it's the big flash and this is a news flash, and I usually draw the same parallels.
That's good, yep.
So.
Good point. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but the Big Bang was not the creation or the explosion into space. It was the creation of space itself. So, yeah, that's a good point.
Yes, sir.
By the way, I'm sorry, the Big Bang was actually a term coined by Fred Hoyle in a derisive way. Fred Hoyle was a believer in the steady state theory, that the theory was static and eternal. And when scientists predicted in 1948 that the universe exploded with a great explosion, he said, what are you going to call that, the Big Bang or something? And the derisive term just stuck. It wasn't supposed to be the term that defined the theory, but it has to this point. I'm sorry, sir, go ahead.
It's fine. Typically, in conferences like this, books I've read, I'm hearing the prophecy-filled argument less and less, and I don't recall hearing that today. Is that something that's falling out of favor, the Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled, like verbatim as they're written? Is that something you don't recommend using often, or is there...
No, I use it on occasion. It's part of expected testimony. We didn't get to it. I just mentioned it briefly. I said Isaiah 53, but there are other prophecies. But technically, the Old Testament prophecy argument begs the question to a certain extent because it assumes the New Testament's true, right? All these Old Testament prophecies are predicting events in the New Testament. But that assumes the New Testament events really occurred. So you've got to show that the New Testament is reliable. on its own before you can say that the Old Testament prophecies were written prior and these events really were predictive or were predicted. So I think it's sort of an argument that adds icing on the cake, if you will. I like early, eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating. There are others you can go through too. Someone else had the mic, by the way? Over here, yes, sir.
I suppose this is more of like a request that you extrapolate on a point rather than more of a question. I gave the book to my parents. They started reading it a while ago. I'm from an atheist household. And they got onto your moral law argument, and it kind of became that kind of thing where it wasn't necessarily an issue of proving themselves right, rather proving me wrong and therefore proving themselves right. And they got onto that moral law argument, and basically what they said and how they based it off of is pretty much that there is no moral law that governs everybody, and that everybody's law is essentially subjective. There are those that feel that, let's say, homosexuality is right, those that say that it's wrong. I'm a Christian, I believe that it's wrong, but somebody else would believe that it's right. And that really the only moral law consistency is that if something is non-consensual, then it is morally incorrect. If you kill somebody, obviously it's not in their best intention that you killed them. You know what I mean?
Then that would be a moral law and God exists then. If there's just one thing morally wrong, God exists. You don't have to have everything figured out.
You can't really say. Basically, it's like if somebody does something to me that I don't want for them to do, then it's morally wrong.
Objectively or subjectively?
I mean, I don't really understand.
Well, if your friend said that everything is subjective, except the issue of consent, that's objective. Well, if that's the case, then God exists. Because objective means outside of us in the object. What's the object? The standard, God. Okay? Subject means in you, the subject. So when people say you can do anything you want as long as you don't hurt somebody else, that's a moral law, right?
Yeah.
Is that just subjective?
Again, I don't necessarily see how that. No, don't get me wrong. I'm a Christian myself, but I don't necessarily see how that necessarily proves the existence of God. If somebody does something to me that I don't like, and I say that's wrong because you did that, and I don't like it, that doesn't necessarily prove that there's a God. If I say, hey, those shoes are cool, and you say, no, that's wrong, who are you to tell me that that's wrong? That's my personal opinion.
Well, the question is, where does the moral law come from? Not how you know it or what is moral and what is moral, but where does a moral law come from? How does an atheist get morality? Ask the atheist. What is the moral law comprised of? 2 parts oxygen, 3 parts hydrogen? There's no chemical composition to morality, just like there's no chemical composition to the law of non-contradiction, which we're using right now. I mean, the laws of logic.
That's like saying there's no chemical composition to emotion or desire. You know what I mean? The morality issue is me saying that what you're doing is wrong. That's my feeling. That's my emotion.
Well, then that's subjective.
So you're saying that emotions can't exist without God?
No. Well, yeah, I would say that, but that's not my argument for God. My argument for God is there is a moral law. Let me give you an example. It's wrong to torture babies for fun. Right? If that's the case, then there has to be a moral law prescriber that has the authority to prescribe that torturing babies for fun is wrong.
But then you go into the consensuality again, right? Let's say it's like it's like comparing Hitler to Kevorkian, right? I mean, the people that went to go see Kevorkian went there specifically being like, listen, I've had enough.
Was Hitler wrong?
Sick of this.
Was Hitler wrong?
I believe that Hitler was wrong, yes.
Okay, why was he wrong?
Because I believe that, and contrary to what, basically he stole what belonged to other people.
Stop. What's wrong with stealing?
Because it's not consensual. If it was consensual, he would have given it to them.
Stop though. What's wrong with not being consensual? You're ultimately going to get down to a moral law here. That you're saying that things are only right if they're consensual. That would be a moral law, right? And if you and I consent to rob a bank, does that make it okay?
I just can't see how you can bridge that gap from just because consensuality between something exists, just because you and I exist, that something is an okay thing to do, that is a basis for justifying that somebody had to have created that. For me to say...
Yeah, okay, well, where does the moral law come from? We all know there's a moral law there.
Like, it would be wrong for me to attack somebody in this room because they would not like that, right? They wouldn't. I mean, some might, but
why is it wrong to do... Why is it wrong to do something to someone that they don't like? Who said? It's the who says argument. Who said it's wrong? You? If it's you, it's in the subject. Hitler? Mother Teresa? You have to get outside of humanity to get an objective moral law.
It's like, I'm going to say it's the golden rule without necessarily saying, because the golden rule is obviously common knowledge before it is necessarily biblical knowledge.
Yes. That's the moral law written on your heart.
It's just that. It's not...
Where does it come from? Well, it's not just how you know something, right or wrong. That's epistemology. Is why is something wrong? What's the authority for it? Who says? Hitler or Mother Teresa? Neither. Somebody above Hitler and Mother Teresa. Remember the two maps of Scotland we had? There's got to be a standard by which we compare Mother Teresa and Hitler to the standard. That's what we're doing. That standard is not material. It's immaterial. Look, you can put it this way. Does everyone agree that all people should do good? Does everyone agree with that? God is the standard of good. Then all people should obey God. Right? Where are we? Yes. Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming out, and this is very helpful. Just a question, just personally. I'm a very prideful, arrogant, easy to get these arguments and want to shoot them at people. In light of the passage that the God of this world has blinded people to see the glory of the gospel in Jesus Christ, how should we, in a sense, use these arguments in a way of not relying on the arguments to the point where we want to win an argument rather than win a person to Christ? Should we have that category? And what does that look like functionally and practically?
All right. Let's go back to that immoral guy, Greg Kokel, who stole my line, stole my joke. I think that you can have conversations with people using Greg's tactics without being offensive. So if you're in a conversation with somebody and somebody says something, like, for example, the Bible's been changed throughout the centuries, so I don't believe it, what should your first question be? What do you mean by that? What do you mean it's been changed? Next question, how did you come to that conclusion? Get the person to support their argument. It's not your job to refute what they say. It's their job to support it. Then I think you've earned the right to say, have you ever considered, and then you can provide an argument back or a book back or some sort of thing you want them to consider. So I think by asking questions, you can bring the guard down for people because you want to learn what they think. Instead of going in there and just basically throwing everything you know at people, that's not the way to win them, is to engage them in conversation and get them to the point where they want to know what you know. And by asking them questions and getting them to reveal their assumptions, I think you can do that. So I think God wants us to rely on our intellect with the help of the Holy Spirit. Christians that don't get brownie points for being stupid. We're told to love the Lord your God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. We're supposed to use arguments. Come, let us reason together. Always be ready to give an answer. It's just in how you do it. So I would use those tactics. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? Have you ever considered? Hey, you can use that in business. You can use that anywhere. It doesn't even have to be with religion or Christianity. You could have an employee say, hey, what do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion, right? There was someone up here who had, I saw somebody right here.
Yeah, okay, one more question and then we'll call it a day.
Okay.
The atheists these days are big on this Osiris, Mithra. Do you want to just briefly give an answer? Because we hear this all the time now.
Sure. Yeah, the Mithra thing is something that you hear quite a bit. So let's just do a quick little slide on that. All right. Everything is supposed to have been copied in the New Testament from all these resurrection myths. First of all, this is too late to influence Christianity. This is from the early 2nd century A.D. Also, this person was born out of a rock, not a virgin, as you hear all the time on the internet. He is said to, or he was said to be a god, not a teacher. He didn't have 12 disciples, and that email that's going around the internet that you hear about. He didn't sacrifice himself. He sacrificed a bull. And we don't know anything about his death, so there was no resurrection. All these things that you hear on the internet, that's where you got to use your questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? Or what's your source of information? This Mithras thing isn't anything. And this idea that the New Testament documents copied from pagan resurrection myths, first of all, most of those resurrection myths are after Christianity. If anybody copied from anybody, it's them copying from Christianity. Second of all, just because you have similarities doesn't mean they're copying. To say so would be to say that all news reports of space shuttle missions were copied from old Star Trek episodes. Right? You have to see. You have to have evidence that there's borrowing, not just assume it because there's similarity. So you get this all the time. You've just got to look at it and see that, first of all, the New Testament documents are reliable documents that have early eyewitness, embarrassing, excruciating testimony in them, and that all these other myths come later, and they have no referent to Christianity. They're not in any way influencing Christianity. If anything, Christianity is influencing them. Okay? So go to our website, crossexamined.org, and then go to the resources page. In fact, there's an article on this on the Tectonics page, which is a good apologetics website, Tectonics, TEKTONICS.org. That's run by J.P. Holding, who's a Christian apologist. There's just a wealth of information out there. We have about 20 or 25 links on our website that go to some of the best apologetics websites you can go to. We don't put everybody up there, just the ones that we know are really good. So if you ever have a question, you can go there. You can look through our articles, our blogs, or you can go to these other sites. We're all in the ball game together. So we have to kind of unite as Christians in order to stem off the tide of unbelief.
PleaseConvinceMe.com also deals with every one of those. Osiris, Horus, Mithras, deals with every one of them.
Right, and one other thing. I need to point this out. Did you guys know there are only 74 shopping days till Christmas? Don't make these poor people send all this stuff back. You start getting Christmas gifts now. All right? Steve, take it away. Thank you very much.
Well said. Thank you, Frank.